What's up, meta nerds? This video will be a breakdown of the variants of the LAATI. We'll do size comparisons and see the history of their use in the Grand Army of the Republic, and end on some behind the scenes facts. Each of them were manufactured by Rothana Heavy Engineering, the same people that made the Acclamator, ATTE, and SPHA. And Rothana was a subsidiary of Hutt Drive Yards, who made just about every other vehicle for the Republic. These transports were all a part of the LAAT line that had several different variants. The LAATI, for Infantry, was the most well-known, bringing 30 passengers and 4 speeder bikes, and packing a punch with 2 forward-facing ball turret light laser cannons, as well as one in the rear, 2 manned composite beam turrets, and then 2 on the wings, along with 4 air-to-air missiles under each wing, and then a pair of 2 mass driver launchers. But if you needed to be more discreet, there was the LAATS, for Stealth, which was used for deep behind enemy lines missions, containing a coating to make it less detectable to sensor arrays, and was modified to be more suited for spacefaring, and came equipped with a hyperdrive. This was mostly used by elite clone squads like Commandos and ARCs, and the only incident that we have details from come from a mission to the separatist-occupied planet of Tehran. This world had incredibly volatile weather conditions, and after an abrupt change in atmosphere, this craft was forced to make a crash landing. And the surface of Tehran was not much better, as they were quickly greeted by a Rogwart, one of the few beasts that is more ferocious than a Rancor, and was that same species kept as a pet by General Grievous. The team of troopers, commandos, and Republic special agents were able to kill it, and instead of letting this secret stealth variant fall into enemy hands, they made sure to pack it full of explosives and blow it to pieces, forcing themselves to find another way off-world. The LAATV, for Vehicle, modified the trooper area to instead carry 16 74Z speeder bikes, 4 times the standard version. And while the standard variant technically could travel through space, it was not built for this role. It could only be done for short times while requiring a containment shield generator to keep oxygen in and space environmental factors out. And that's where the simply titled Space Gunship variant comes in. These replaced the bubble turrets with these floodlights, and the doors were completely sealed off from space. The ion engines had to be upgraded, as the standard LAATI could not go from atmosphere to outer space, though it could descend from space to the surface. Because the LAATI could not overcome most planets' gravitational pull, instead it would have to link up with the Acclamator to then be shuttled to their next location, or shuttled into space where it could make the jump from Acclamator to Venator. But this variant cuts out all those complicated steps. Now the LAATC, for Carrier, is the most common variant, which could be used to carry a single ATTE, Republic Troop Transport, Saber Tank or Falchion Tank, PX-4 Mobile Command Base or Forward Command Center, or 4 ATXTs. While the Infantry variant was 85,000 credits, the Carrier was more than twice that at 175,000. It had the same top atmospheric speed at 620 km per hour or 385 miles per hour, which is just a bit faster than the HMP droid gunship. Achieving this same top speed with a much heavier load is a testament to the upgraded ion engines. These are also improved with a medium-range communications to make sure that their relief could be coordinated with the Acclamator in atmosphere and the commanders on the ground, as well as the other LAATCs and LAATIs in the AO. It was also lengthened considerably, from 17.69 meters or 58 feet to 28.82 meters or 95 feet. Making it about 64% larger, or more than 2 ARC-170s. This would also see changes to the armament, losing all of the composite beam bubble turrets and mass driver launchers, but added another aft light laser cannon, while keeping the forward ball turrets and 4 anti-armor rockets, allowing the 3-man crew to lay down fire against light targets while completing their delivery. Which wasn't always vehicles, but could be aid in the form of munitions, food and water, or medical supplies, while also being used to remove things from the battlefront, be it enemy craft that Command wanted to examine for extracting intel from their droid brain, or simple natural barriers like boulders and vegetation, rubble from destroyed buildings.
The tank lifters are here to move the debris as ordered, General.
Or in the most unique case, the removal of a Zillo Beast. While some stats say it could carry 40 tons, I think that's just based on the ATTE, as that's the exact weight of the walker. And if we look at the removal of the Zillo Beast, just 4 of them were able to move a 60,000 ton beast. So a single one should move something around 15,000 tons. Like with most Republic craft, they did see some use in the Empire during the time of transition, where they would be seen transporting K-79 S-80 Imperial troop transports and RTT-04 armed troop transports. This Imperial era would also see the successor, the MAAT, or Multi-Altitude Assault Transport, which added an extra set of wings for more lift, spacefaring engines, and armor-plated turrets instead of energy shielding. And this craft would also serve alongside the IDT, or Imperial Dropship Transport, which had 2 mass driver missile launchers and a pair of light laser cannons. But although it was only an Ewok shorter, it lost nearly half the passengers, from 30 down to just 18. So that's it for these LAAT variants, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The predecessor to the LAAT line was the VAAT-E, or Variable Altitude Assault Transport Enforcement, used by the Coruscant Security Force, which introduced the mass driver launcher and had dual heavy laser turrets. It was 1.5 times the length while only carrying half the passengers. When the LAAT was made for the Clone Army, this came full circle with the variant the LAAT-LE, or Law Enforcement model, that was less armed but would remain in service everywhere from Coruscant to Lothal, all throughout the Imperial era as well. Many of these stats come from the incredible cross-sections books, the Clone Wars Campaign Guide, Essential Guide to Vehicles and Vessels, and Galaxy at War, while the MAAT appeared in the PS2, PSP, and Wii versions of The Force Unleashed, while the IDT was in other versions, with the VAAT coming from Star Wars Bounty Hunter. The real-world inspiration for the LAAT comes from the Mi-24 Hind, while the carrier would be something like the S-64 Sky Crane and Chinook variants, which could carry all sorts of vehicles and objects. And for stealth helicopters, there are things like the RAH-66 Kamachi, and even modifications that are made to Blackhawks, like those used during the Osama raid, which were quieter and had radar scrambling materials. But that's it for all the variants of the LAAT. The best ways to help me out are to hit that like button, leave a comment, and share it with somebody who might want to see it. All those really help promote in the YouTube algorithm, and be sure to subscribe if you want to see more. But most important of all, remember, if you're in the market for a heavily armed flying minivan, there are a ton of options to choose from, and the Force will be with you. Always.
Cutler Queen. And I'm just a simple farmer. You're a deserter.
What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is going to explain the role of what might be the most classified unit in the Grand Army of the Republic. I will get into some references to Bad Batch and speculation towards the end, but I'll give another warning before I get into that part. Of all the specializations in the Republic military, from the Coruscant Guard to the Bad Batch, the Arcs and the Marines, only one unit was at the personal directive of the Supreme Chancellor. Known only as the Covert Ops clone troopers, they were not classified as a part of the Special Operations Brigade, which was headed by Jedi General Arla Zay, and which commanded the likes of Delta and Omega Squad, the Shadow Troopers, and even the Assassins whose sole purpose was to be a failsafe against the Jedi, actually trained by Jedi to learn how to get around their Force powers, just in case one of their own became a traitor, something that was an obvious worry to everyone in the Republic, with the CIS being led by a fallen Jedi. So while it might seem odd at first that there was a hit squad under the command of the Chancellor, it was seen as just one part of a series of specialized units that fell under the command of different positions, all acting in a way as a sort of checks on balances of power, complementing the contingency orders that were known to exist. Order 66 was not a secret. The inhibitor chips were a secret and acted as an insurance policy, but the clones already would have been expected to kill the Jedi simply because this was a direct order from a superior. The punishment for not carrying out any of these contingency orders was to be declared a traitor and executed. There were multiple orders to remove the Supreme Chancellor from office, like Order 65 allowing the use of lethal force to remove him if the majority of the Senate or Security Council deemed him unfit. And keep in mind that the Senator was always with Senate guards or the Coruscant guards, just as the Jedi Generals were always with their clones. Usually thought of protecting the people they were with, but they played this dual role of being a means of instantly calling in a check on power. If that order was ever given, the Chancellor or the Jedi could be blasted by the people with them. And the Supreme Chancellor was the head of the GAR, had the most intel of any individual in the military, and was granted this elite Covert Ops unit to act quickly and efficiently on that intel. These clones had no restrictions and reported only to the Supreme Chancellor. The Director of Special Forces would only infer the actions of this unit, passing on intel and laying out operations that would be referred to as dirty work, and then Palpatine would make a decision on how to respond at his own discretion, understanding both the political ramifications and having the most military intel. Now, if you think something like this is surprisingly dark for the virtuous Republic, just keep in mind that Order 37 was known to senators. It was also not a secret. Reading, quote, capture of a single wanted individual through the mass arrest and threatened execution of a civilian population. Follow-up directives include scenarios for body disposal of civilian casualties and suppression of communications. And we don't know the order number, but RC-3222 mentioned one of these 150 orders concerned protocol for, quote, reducing key allied worlds to slag if they switch sides. So checks on everything from chancellors to Jedi and even whole planets. And then the covert ops most often acted as checks on their own brothers. While their purview could entail anything, they would often hunt down other clones. Troopers could not be allowed to defect in this galaxy at war. Ostensibly, the reason would be to prevent any intel from falling into separatist hands. Whether they were willing traitors wanting to hurt the Republic like Slick working with Ventress, or even if it was against their own will, with technologies existing to force the clone to become a tool for the CIS, like we saw with Echo being attached to a supercomputer to counter Republic tactics. Any clone not accounted for was a potential massive threat to the entire GAR. These covert ops troops were in some ways the precursors to the Death Troopers, with specialized but still mostly classified enhancements that made them both more physically apt, but also psychologically more capable of carrying out ops that were expected to be too difficult for standard troopers. These hit squads were doing things that were considered, quote, questionable and unethical, though they were not bred for this specialized role like clone commanders were. Rather, as Wallen Val, one of Jango's Quaivaldar Mandalorians that trained the clones, noted about one squad, quote, they were just ordinary troopers who'd shown a bit of promise for dirty work, selected from the ranks to backfill some of the roles that would have otherwise fallen to Republic commando squads. So showing exceptional ruthlessness and a lack of conscience could get you promoted to Palpatine's hit squad. As for their equipment, not much has been declassified, but they were known to use modified DC-15A and DC-15S blasters, while the most striking visual difference is this purplish coloring. This armor contained a polymer called Reflect, something that in all of the Republic and Imperial military is only seen in the armor of Death Troopers. But interestingly, there was also a bounty hunter called Mist, who had a photoreactive personal armor that contained microscopic crystals that could adapt to reflect incoming light and make the wearer nearly invisible. She also had it coated in Reflect, since this material was specifically designed to make one invisible to nearly all forms of sensors. So she would be practically invisible to both the naked eye and to any technology. So while we cannot confirm that the covert ops troopers had the more detailed microscopic crystal tech, they certainly were undetectable to all forms of sensors. And I do think it's highly likely that they would have access to this photoreactive coating as well, being the most secretive elite unit in existence, and definitely with no budget issues. And there are also things like the Sinrich optical dephaser used by Rook, and the holographic disguise matrix, aka the shadow hologram. So this tech was definitely available and almost required for the Republic to carry out these unethical missions, killing their own clones and even civilians if need be. Why would you not use this visual cloaking alongside the Reflect? You get to decide who eyewitness accounts blame, and also because of the Reflect, no droid would be able to detect them. Because of all of these high-tech stealth solutions, none of their missions were ever revealed to the public. The only way we know about one of their hits was because it failed due to a pure accident due to two elite units unknowingly operating in the same area. The covert ops only had a max of 3 troopers ever deployed at once, and on this particular mission they had the more standard 2-man team. Alpha 30, known as Sol, was an Alpha-class advanced recon commando who went AWOL after suspecting the true purpose of the clone army in Palpatine's schemes. Members of Omega Squad were on the planet Gaftakar to assist in the training of local resistance trying to overthrow the Separatist leadership. They came across this AWOL clone, and Omega Squad were able to capture him and were able to extract info from him. But they actually agreed with his argument for freedom and let this AWOL clone go, who promptly fled off-world. Republic Commando RC-1136, aka Darman, personally trained by Jango's second-in-command Cal Scarada, would then return to Alpha 30's hideout. The pair of these covert ops troopers entered the building thinking Darman was their target. But this commando, who was the sole survivor of a previous squadron, one of the best trained in the military, was able to best these two troopers. Even this elite trooper Darman and the rest of Omega Squad had no clue about the existence of these oddly armed and armored clones. They were outraged and confused how there could be this overlap in area of operation, and deeply disturbed that there was a secret hit squad that was sent out to kill other clones, making them believe even more in Sol's claims against Palpatine. Now I want to turn to the events of this first Bad Batch episode. Spoilers and speculation are incoming. We see how Tarkin is transitioning towards conscription troops, Something that we talked about in other videos is that taking your troops from the population all across the galaxy works to tie communities to the Empire, instilling patriotism tied to a paycheck, and puts potentially rebellious and rowdy lower classes to work spreading your empire. And as Tarkin highlighted in this episode, it was also cheaper than clones. The stormtroopers were certainly less skilled, and this is why we see Tarkin making sure that he develops an elite special forces branch as well, inspecting Bad Batch, only to be disappointed that they were mostly traitors, with the exception of Crosshair. After Crosshair's inhibitor chip was enhanced, we see him donning armor that looks to be a precursor of the Death Troopers. The Death Troopers would become elite bodyguards, but also reflect-coded hit squads used to tie up loose ends in the Empire, much like the previous Covert Ops troops. I think this story could evolve to see Crosshair heading up the elite forces birthed to track down and eliminate Bad Batch, as well as other clone deserters like Hutt, and of course the Jedi survivors. So let me know what you think of this and the potential adaptation of this Legends idea into the new canon. I think this is a perfect time to cover these troopers, as I really do expect that if we're going to be exploring this Imperial Transition era, we'll see Crosshair or someone else developing out a hit squad type unit. As for the behind the scenes facts, the Covert Ops were first introduced in the novel Republic Commando True Colors, and mentioned in Order 66, a Republic Commando novel. The idea is based on real-world death squads used by tons of current governments, and with the US specifically, there is the Disposition Matrix, aka the Kill List, with targets being eliminated by special forces or more often by drone strikes. And this idea of a ruler having a small elite force to carry out hits quickly and efficiently is one of the oldest and most consistent in history. It is odd how little of this was explored in Star Wars lore during the Clone Wars. Even in the Imperial era, we mostly see things in the form of the Inquisitors, but not as much highlighting a force within the Imperial military. So let me know what you think about the Bad Batch and where it might go in the future, and what you think of a potential rivalry between Crosshair squads and the Bad Batch. Likes and comments really help to promote the video on YouTube, but most important of all, remember, be careful what you say about the Emperor. You never know if there's an invisible, undetectable hit squad in your room with a DC-15. And the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, meta nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of the Acclamator class assault ship. We'll see the context surrounding its creation, a size comparison, take a look inside the ship and understand how it all worked, and then cover its history and all the different variants from the Clone Wars to Imperial Era. Let's start with the context. When a Mune banker named Higo Damask traveled to the extragalactic world of Kamino to feel out the possibility of creating a clone army, the most difficult obstacle was to work with the human genome, being an ever unpredictable species, while the easiest part was manufacturing the millions of arms, armor, explosives, and ships and vehicles from the ATRT to Venator. As Kuat Drive Yards and their subsidiary Rathana Heavy Engineering had been in the business of plunging a galaxy into war for more millennia than most species had space travel. As Old Republic Fleet Admiral Ago once put it, quote, "Since the dawn of the Republic, Kuat Drive Yards has been the exclusive supplier of many of our greatest warships," end quote. Roughly 800 years before the Clone Wars, the incredibly mineral-rich wild space planet of Rathana was discovered, and promptly bought up by KDY. Here, the subsidiary Rathana Heavy Engineering would be essentially just an extension of the parent company, layers upon layers to avoid Republic intervention, operating for far longer than any politician, and amassing more wealth than entire star systems, causing many to feel companies like Kuat Drive Yards were the true rulers of the galaxy. Much like the way Higo Damask, secretly a Sith known as Darth Plagueis, would also guide galactic affairs from the shadows. When the cloners placed the largest private order in history in the year 31 BBY, just months after the Battle of Naboo, within the company, all work on these machines of war fell under the top-secret Project Icefang, and they even undertook the arduous task of maintaining what became in essence their own private hyperspace lane, directly from Rathana to Kamino, going through the Rishi Maze. Keep in mind that canon novels like Master and Apprentice, and tons of Legends books as well, note the intense drama around systems and their hyperspace lanes, how difficult it was to maintain smaller lanes as celestial objects move through space, and how the Republic often did not put up enough credits to maintain some systems, effectively cutting them off like an old town losing a railroad stop. And so think about the power of Kuat Drive Yards to maintain this private lane on their own. In the stilt cities of Kamino, Rathana creations like the ATTE were used in their massive training facilities, while the Mandalorian trainers of Jango's Quai Valdar worked with the clones to train on these vessels in Kaminoan space. I think we often overlook just how incredible this must have been for those Mandalorian mercs. For a time, the entire Republic military was first in their hands. So just imagine the glee these warriors had being able to play with toys of this size. At a length of 752 meters, or nearly half a mile, it was 2/3 the length of the Venator, and more than twice the Arquitans, while being 460 meters, or more than a quarter mile wide, which was 84% that of the Venator, or 27 LAATs across. And it had a height of 183 meters, or 600 feet, making it about 69% that of the Venator, or equal to 19 ATTEs. If it showed up here on Earth, it would be more than twice the length of the Nimitz-class carrier, 8.5 football stadiums across, and twice the height of the Statue of Liberty. And there's no official stats for this, but the size of the ramp seems to be about 29 meters or 95 feet across. I'm basing that on the cross-section and what we see with the Zillo Beast and vehicles coming down the ramp. Now let's take a look inside, but first we have to get past that armor, which is layers of Durasteel infused with neutronium. Almost every ship used Durasteel in the hull, but the Acclamator is the only known ship to be infused with this energy-dispersing material. Moving inside, let's start our tour with the power systems. Unlike the larger Star Destroyers, the main Hypermatter Annihilator reactor does not protrude, and we can see the frame structure that holds it in place. This ring is the fuel inlet manifold, which connects to these series of hypermatter fuel tanks. And we can see a subsidiary backup reactor located here. This fuel is so dense that it is magnitudes heavier than the rest of the ship. And while this fuel is so energy efficient, the insane power requirements of these enormous ships needed to generate shields, jump to hyperspace, and power these incredible engines means that they did need to be regularly refueled, either at space stations or with things like the Ultor-class replenishment ship, and later Imperial tanker, which have been around for years in Legends. Out of this reactor was this channel that emitted streams of particles out of the thrusters. The main thruster has the emitter split up into 8 electromagnetic thrust vectoring panels to control the direction of flow, while the auxiliary thruster is less powerful but enables the Acclamator to have greater maneuverability. Power generated for the rest of the ship is channeled through this power core, and this chamber is not subjected to the artificial gravity generators, while these tubes would take this energy out to other systems. Moving to the aft, we see these power system cooling neutrino radiator grills, which channel out heat from the reactor, the anti-grav repulsor generator, which is the tech that helps the ship float and get off the ground, and the grills also help disperse heat generated from the hyperdrive. Now this system produced a max power of 2 × 10 to the 23rd watts, while the shielding was 7 × 10 to the 22nd watts, with the thrusters pumping out a max acceleration of 3,500 G, and a top atmospheric speed of 1,200 km per hour or 746 miles per hour, making it equal to the incredibly fast TIE Fighter, and faster than the Venator, which is often praised for how quick it is. While in hyperspace, it's even more impressive for its role, being able to scramble the enormous complement of troops and vehicles across the entire galaxy faster than every capital ship, even every starfighter. It was quicker than Slave 1 in both atmosphere and in hyperspace, with only the Millennium Falcon under Han's modifications at peak being slightly faster in hyperspace with a 0.5 class rating. And this combined with all the fuel packed on board gave it a hyperdrive range of 250,000 light years, meaning it could cross the entire galaxy and back 2.5 times. For easy maintenance at Republic shipyards, the engine could be removed by itself via these engine servicing release hatches, and there was the power system maintenance vents. As for the armament, you can see the 4 heavy missile and torpedo launcher tubes, which could fire the standard loadout of 100 high-yield proton torpedoes and 20 assault concussion missiles. Spread across the surface were 24 point defense laser cannons for taking out starfighters, and 12 quad turbo laser turrets for every other type of ship from transports to capital ships. And when a target did not need to be captured, or if the enemy forces were in bunkers deep underground, several Acclamators would come together to execute a base Delta Zero fleet bombardment. This used the nuclear bomb level power of turbolaser batteries to liquefy rock, turning the crust of worlds into molten slag that would melt through until it reached the enemies. We can only see this one regional shield generator node, but these would have been all along the edge of the ship. And this bridge is much more slender than other Kuat models, and most of the bridge is actually in an area that has no windows, and instead provides tactical information via a holographic display, though there was still this small strip of windows towards the front, while the rest of this entire section was dedicated to sensor arrays. Now, looking at all these decks, there appear to be about 17 in total, having everything you would need for long voyages in space, mess hall recreation areas, storage for consumables that could reach 11,250 tons, equal to the weight of 13,235 dewbacks. There were logistic and strategy conference rooms for generals to meet in, but most of these rooms were the barracks for the 700-man crew, and 16,000 clone troopers. To put that in perspective, that's 8 times the troops aboard a Venator, and 1.6 times that even on the Imperial 1 class Star Destroyer, which shows just how perfect this ship is for its role. Not to slug it out in ship-to-ship combat, but to lead invasions intended to take entire planets. Which means an entire corps could pack into just 3 of these, and still have tons of room left over for auxiliary troops or local allies. And we haven't even talked about the vehicles yet. Along the periphery of the hangar were the 48 ATTE walkers, 36 self-propelled heavy artillery, and 320 speeder bikes. While the majority of the hangar floor would accommodate the LAAT gunship variants, which would be organized into their own landing zones, these alternating numbered rectangles on the floor. And there was a rail system that the gunships could attach to move them to different surface areas, along with the descending lift platform that took them to a lower maintenance bay, which could also be used for any of the other vehicles. Ships could enter and exit through several of the side hangar openings, though the main gunship exit was the ventral opening through which LAATs could leave side by side, while the larger carrier would have to exit single file, with the troops and vehicles exiting via the main ramps that open up on each side for rapid deployment, and could be used in concert with the repulsor system to hover in place without landing, so that almost any landing pad could be used even when it couldn't set down, like we see on Kamino. When it could touch down, these 3 enormous stabilizing legs would keep it level on any terrain. And what helps to hold this all together are the acceleration compensators and tensor integrity fields located at the forward and aft, which helps to offset the gravitational warpings of the repulsor lifts and the intense G-forces. Now, the first clone forces ever to be deployed were transported via the at least 12 Acclamators that delivered the LAATs, which would race into the Petronaki arena to rescue what was left of the Jedi Strike Team. After this successful opening to the Clone Wars, a massive military display was organized on the upper levels of Coruscant, showing the might of their new army, a sight so impressive that Masamida was temporarily lost in their beauty. The success of the Acclamator at Geonosis immediately sparked a race for Republic military contracts, with Kuat's greatest rival since the Old Republic, Rendili Star Drives, jumping into the fray and hoping to carve out a piece of the pie with spy ships and starships. But Kuat and their subsidiary Rathana were watching the credits roll in as the war raged on, with 1,000 Acclamators ordered in just the first weeks, at a price of 110 million credits each, which is nearly twice the price tag on a Venator. And there were specialized versions like the Nevuda B, which carried 156 V-19 Torrents used during the Battle of Munilinst. And over the course of the war, almost every invasion would involve Acclamators, with Venators securing the star system and preventing reinforcements from making it to the surface. They would see notable uses on Christophsis, Teth, Seleucami, Kamino, Sullust, and then to Umbara, Kiros, and Naboo. We saw its enormous hangar and cargo capacity used by Commander Wolf to deliver aid to Aileen, and during the capture of the orbital ring of Ringovinda. Though during the Battle of Ryloth, we saw that the CIS tactical supercomputers that were the T-Series droids did find a weakness in this ship, using the fact that the J-1 fired solid projectiles instead of plasma balls like a turbo laser, meaning they were less likely to be absorbed and diffused by the energy shield or the neutronium-infused armor plating, finding the perfect area near the thrusters to incapacitate the invading Acclamators. Toward the end of the war, they would produce the Acclamator II, which was inferior in every way, from a certain point of view, as it carried less vehicles, less troops, but it did require a much larger crew. That might seem like another bad thing, but when we see that this is a 28x multiplier, I think we're seeing more evidence of Palpatine's strategy to tie the population to the military. I've mentioned this in a lot of Imperial vehicle breakdowns, but the crew requirements shoot up in the Imperial era where no one can really make sense of them. My theory says that this makes sense when we look at things like the Tarkin and Thrawn books that show how the populations were made loyal, that the military was seen as a stable source of income for many otherwise hopeless people of remote parts of the galaxy, as the Empire pitched itself as at constant war with chaos, seen in the form of local criminals and anarchist rebel terrorists. They would make it seem like they were forced to take over businesses like Price's families on Lothal, and citizens would see signing up for the service as the best way to get out of your dangerous and poor city. So Palpatine took massive amounts of citizens away from the criminals and rebel recruiters of their hometown, stuck them in Imperial ships with strict command structures from loyal superiors, and now these people from all over the galaxy saw their success tied to the success of the Empire. Many regular Acclamator 1s were scrapped, or would see the sad fate of being retrofitted into a pure cargo vessel called the Imperial Cargo Ship, something that was the target of rebel attacks, most notably the hijacking of 4 of these in the year 0 ABY. And perhaps these, or other modified variants, are what Darth Vader once described as acclamators that had become slave ships, though some in their original form still operated in the more remote areas of the Empire, while Kuat drive yards continued to dominate with a line of Imperial-class Star Destroyers, and the Victory, which was considered the spiritual successor to the Acclamator. So that's it for the breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. It was first introduced in Episode 2, with details coming from the Attack of the Clones Incredible Cross-Sections and Complete Cross-Sections books. There are some discrepancies, as they say that the bridge was completely windowless, while in the Clone Wars the depiction has a few windows. And in the original Battlefront 2 we can see it in a frigate role, though almost all other sources have it not used for capital ship combat when it could be avoided. Though of course the armament was powerful, and could if it needed to. And then for the details on the context of this ship, there's some from the Darth Plagueis novel, but a lot of it comes from the Essential Guide to Warfare. So that's it for the Acclamator. But most important of all, remember, when your enemy will melt through your planet's crust just to get you, just turn yourselves into the Laser Sword Magicians. And the Force will be with you. Always.
It's ingenious. You could create a database to identify anyone in the galaxy.
Some of Miko's thugs have decent prices on their heads, too. I'll transmit the info to your ID scanner.
If you get scanned and your genetic signature shows up on any New Republic register, you're gonna be detected.
Every citizen can exchange their invalid currency for Imperial credits.
My chain code has been encoded in this armor for 25 years.
What's up, meta nerds? This video is going to explain the chain code and all the technologies that work with it. We'll get into how the tracking fobs work and why these technologies were so useful to the Empire and the bounty hunting profession. And we'll end on some real-world behind-the-scenes facts. To put it simply, or as simply as possible, the chain code is the Empire's attempt to combine genetic or material info, social security numbers, and a sort of Wikipedia page, and then put it on a blockchain. That sounds really confusing, but after reading up a bunch and grabbing all these clips, I gotta say I like this idea, and it is surprisingly sci-fi for the usually sci-fantasy Star Wars universe. Let's get the blockchain part out of the way first. You got the reference right in the name. The chain code of an individual would be recorded on tons of different servers throughout the galaxy, making it nearly impossible to hack or change that data. I did laugh when I thought that I'm going to try and explain how cryptocurrencies work within an already complex lore topic, but to vastly oversimplify it, let's say I track the sale of every droid, ship, or armor sold every minute. We call a minute worth of transactions a block, and then other Imperial computers track this block as well. Every minute these are cross-referenced to the previous block to show a connected chain of ownership. When Palpatine heard this, he thought, let's apply that to people. This is where I get to the Wikipedia part of this equation. Let's say we tracked everywhere you went, what schools you went to, criminal history, bank account info, and even a list of friends and relatives, and that summary of you was recorded on the blockchain as well. To access this file, we'll give each citizen a number, and even a physical card containing this information for convenience. But the real magic is that you can combine all of this with biometric scanners. While still just theoretical tech here on Earth, as sci-fi goes, this isn't too much of a stretch to think that this could be a real technology, that you could point it at a being and read its genome without needing to take a physical blood sample. The only problem with the system that I just outlined is that without this genetic component, one could still fake their identity. The blockchain limits you to taking on someone else's identity. You can't craft a new one out of thin air or change your own, because everyone's record is recorded on that chain and confirmed on multiple independent computers. Hacking some Imperial terminal on Tatooine won't change what the historic blockchain was, which had already been long recorded. So if there wasn't that genetic component, you could be some notorious killer posing as some other person with similar features. But with the ability to scan one's DNA and get the results instantaneously, you can match it with the genome associated with the chain code number. Each of these elements working together are what makes this such an incredible way to have a near flawless tracking of materials, credits, and most importantly, individuals all across your galaxy-spanning empire. Now, this technology had actually been in place for some time before the organization of the Galactic Empire, but it seems to have only been applied to criminals. Much like how there is no database with fingerprints and DNA of every citizen, but there is one for some criminals. So the Republic had a system like this that bounty hunters were able to access to track their targets, with a biometric scanner used most famously by Jango Fett, where he could scan anyone around him to see if there were any active bounties on them. Decades later, we see that this system was still being used by the bounty hunting guilds, with the Fob being a handy version of that biometric scanning tech, that instead of actively scanning individuals, it's instead pinging out to see if it detects a specific genome nearby, while the Puck works to visually show the information about the target. The Fob and Bounty Puck work off of this database, the blockchain that survived the Empire itself, still being used at a time when Imperial credits were no good. The proof of how good this system was can be seen in the exceptions that prove the rule. It was almost unheard of to go after a target without a chain code, but this is what Din Djarin was met with when he was tasked by the Imperial Remnant to hunt down Grogu.
Let's see the Puck.
No Puck. Face to face. Direct commission. All I know is no chain code.
Interestingly, we find that the child does have a chain code, but that the Imperial doesn't want to give it up.
We can only offer you a tracking fob.
What's the chain code?
We can only provide the last 4 digits.
Their age. That's all you can give me?
He doesn't tell him, perhaps because he worries that this sort of wiki page on Grogu would reveal all sorts of info that the Empire didn't want anyone to know. I think there's a great mystery here on why this would be recorded at all in the first place, details on Grogu's past that we will hopefully learn about in the future. It should be noted that as evil and invasive as this system sounds to us, once implemented, there were surely countless examples of how this system worked to capture criminals, securing trade, and likely making day-to-day business a lot easier. To the point that the New Republic apparently kept this system in place, as Cara Dune was worried about getting picked up on an NR scan, knowing that her crimes would be forever recorded in this blockchain.
If anybody runs my chain code, I'll rot in a cell for the rest of my life. If I so much as book passage on a ship registered to the Republic,
I have a ship.
And even back when Han Solo was still a young nerf herder, we can hear Imperial advisories concerning this blockchain record and how it also tracks goods.
You don't have a boarding pass. No access without ID chip. All droids must be registered.
This is still only 6 years after the formation of the Empire, so perhaps we are seeing a population that's still transitioning. Note that it mentions droid registration, and we see ship registration with Bad Batch, and all of this was a part of the same system to track everything. Perfect for a period of coming civil war. Palpatine knowing that the next threat would come from his own citizens, so imagine when a rebel camp gets discovered. Every droid, blaster, ship, vehicle, and person can be tracked down this chain of interactions, cross-referenced with others to see if there were locations and individuals in common, tracking who paid for it, etc. One of the critiques of Bitcoin was that criminals love it, and that the anonymity was used for crime, but over time more experts are showing that this really isn't true. It's far too trackable. The whole point is that there's a public recorded ledger. And so because all of your credits were also on this system, in this scenario you'd end up seeing a lot of credits coming from Alderaan, purchasing things that coincidentally down the line end up in the hands of rebels. And with Han, we may be seeing him being issued his chain code along with this physical card. It could just be his boarding pass, or both, as it is likely that there were enormous amounts of unregistered people and materials on planets, only being forced to record once people wanted to move to the bigger cities or travel off-world. Logistically, it must have taken a very long time to get to 100% registration for every citizen on every world. This likely wasn't achieved over the less than 3 decades of Imperial rule. Another instance of goods being on the chain is with Boba Fett's armor. Now it could be a separate blockchain record, Mando chain for example, as opposed to Imp coin.
My chain code has been encoded in this armor for 25 years.
He says that it is his chain code entered into the armor. This could just be a shorthand for all forms of technology, as most people in our world call all crypto Bitcoin. And I question that it is the Imperial chain code because the events mentioned are decades before it was introduced, but he does say that he encoded it, so it could mean simply that he wanted to have his armor recorded to him in this ledger, to without a doubt tie it to Boba Fett. But again, I have the question why the system would allow you to craft a background story for an item that was registered. This text is translated to say, Foundling, took into the year, the text is cut off, then Concord Dawn, where Jango was born. Then it mentions Mentor Jast with the R cut off from Jango's mentor Jaster Muriel, who's the one who adopted him as a foundling into the Mandalorians. And then it says Father Fett followed by Boba Fett as the current owner. But for a blockchain system like this to be taken serious, you can't make up the past ownership. It merely logs who owns it now, and then a chain of ownership is updated over time. So perhaps we are seeing that this blockchain-like tech was around for a lot longer and used to track important things like a family's armor. with different cultures having their own ledgers using this blockchain technology and making things like Mando Chain. Now there are a bunch of other interesting tidbits and questions I wanted to bring up at the end here. If this is so impenetrable, then how could Tech so easily craft fake IDs? Well, because he was at the very beginning of the block. From now on though, their genome, name, biographical data, etc. are all tracked within this blockchain system. But when did this bioscan take place? I wonder if they can get DNA out of the skin samples, or if perhaps that card had microscopic devices that scratch or capture blood to be read by the handheld scanner. But like mentioned earlier, there seems to be technology to read genome at a distance.
If you get scanned and your genetic signature shows up on any New Republic register,
like with Django's scanner, and even with Tech, we can see how he can quickly identify any plant or animal life anywhere in the galaxy. Perhaps this is done visually, just referencing a database of images, but since this genome technology does exist, I don't see why it wouldn't be used in something like Tech Scanner. And of course, there have been things like lifeform scanners since the very beginning of Star Wars.
Hold your fire, there's no life forms.
And I'm not sure how this might fit in, but it's something to definitely be aware of, is that lifeform scanners are one of the only things that can still detect someone even when they're using a cloaking device or stealth field. These two stealth technologies usually block both visual detection, but also all forms of sensors, except apparently lifeform scanners. But then why do the midichlorian tests require a blood sample? Maybe Tech has improved. It has been 13 years, though I kinda doubt this as Star Wars tech doesn't change much over time. Instead, it's likely that the midichlorian test is just more complicated. You would want to be extra careful with something like this. Your genome is in every cell, as opposed to picking up on these different organisms distributed in varying ways across an individual's body. And you definitely want to use the best processing you can if it means you'll be taking a child away from their parents. But even with the bioscanner, it seems like this wasn't always available to every trooper, as we do see that unlike Django just scanning everyone that walks by, troopers ask for identification, so maybe they don't all have portable scanners, or this is the result of some semblance of civil rights that they do ask for it. So I really hope this puts chain code into the bigger context of the lore, and explains how and why this is the perfect tool for Palpatine. But you also definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. There's a bunch of references to chain codes being like social security numbers, like when the client says that I can only give you the last 4. That's usually all people will ask for of your social. And the fact that it references when Grogu was born is a reference to the group number part of your social. While in Star Wars the bad guys are overtly evil, the first social security numbers were issued in 1936, and were for determining entitlement programs for just a small amount of the population. This grew over the decades, applying to everyone, and being linked to your income and banking, though they were not automatically given to everyone at birth until 1986, half a century after being introduced. The name chain code is a reference to the blockchain, and that you need a code or key to access your cryptocurrency. For some personal lore, I find this whole subject fascinating and genuinely listen to and see valid points from both sides of the crypto convo. I could see it both being an extremely good thing and being manipulated by some evil force like this. It is a new concept. I'm not aware of any sci-fi novels that show how this could be implemented in some future society. If you do know of any, please leave a comment down below. But I found this lore to be exceptionally good sci-fi for Star Wars. It's pretty scary how plausible and inevitable it would all be if you just had that missing piece of scanning your DNA at a distance. But let me know what you think of this concept in Star Wars and how it works. But that's it for the chain code. The best way to help me out is to hit that like button and leave a comment below. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future videos like this. But most important of all, remember, yesterday's conspiracy theory device is today's basic necessity. And the Force will be with you, always.
I knew you were connected, but to have learned of recent events and be here already, I don't impress easy, but well done.
The data brought to us by the Bothan spies pinpoints the exact location of the Emperor's new battle station. Many Bothans died to bring us this information.
What's up, meta nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of the Bothan species, looking into their biology, homeworld, and history, and ending on some behind the scenes facts. Let's head to grid coordinates R14, the mid-rim of the galaxy, to the planet Bothui. This was a very Earth-like world, with Type 1 atmosphere which was breathable to most species, and covered in diverse landscapes from plains, forests, mountains, and large oceans with a pair of ice caps at the poles. Unlike other humanoid species like the Zabrak or Twi'lek, there is no evidence that the Bothans were artificially created, except for the larger mystery over the vast number of humanoid species that hints to a shared creation or ancestor in the form of the Celestials. A race far more ancient than even the Rakata, and who shaped the galaxy as we know it with their ability to move stars and planets. but some evidence that does point to an artificial creation is that Bothans can interbreed with humans, seen most notably with Jedi Lord Valentine Farfalla. And so, though not confirmed, the other species that we know can interbreed with humans were artificially created from the Rakata. But since the best universities on Coruscant have yet to confirm an alien involvement in Bothan evolution, we will assume that they naturally evolved on Bothawai, a lush and dangerous world with skies filled with various birds of prey, and even reptilian creatures dubbed the Bothan Sky Dragons, the Rawls or stone rays that could camouflage while sunning on rocks, packing a venomous stinger tail, razor-sharp beaks, and hard needle teeth. While on land, there were stampeding herds of Ganjuku, which had thick hair over their tough skin and teeth that were so large and sharp that they were prized across the galaxy to be made into daggers, all used to fight off the Krekjaya, a deadly feline predator, and the Skarkla, a bipedal crocodile rancor-like beast, while even plants could kill you with things like the Halkra or so-called strangle vines, whose subspecies could be found on every continent, adapting to be almost indistinguishable from countless other harmless vines. The Halkra's 12 tentacle-like vines would spread out over several meters, springing into action upon contact to pull the prey into the plant's digestive sac. And though the seas were surprisingly peaceful, even the soil possessed threats to Bothan evolutionary success, with scowworms and radarks that lurked right under their feet. All of this gives us the context for the rise of this small furry species, as this environment pressured each living thing to develop great defensive measures, or deadly weapons, or in the case of the Bothans, a brilliant mind. Much like humans, they were one of the easiest prey to kill, and lacked the claws and power of the predators. But over eons, each generation was growing smarter and smarter. Even the modern Bothan only stood 1.5 meters, or just under 5 feet tall, putting them in between an Ewok and a Wookiee. It's unknown how short their lifespan was during the formation of their civilization, and that long road to becoming the dominant species on Bothawai. But by the time they became a spacefaring race, their average lifespan was 85 years, a bit longer than most other humanoids. And they did develop their own spacefaring technology independently from any other species, eventually coming into contact with intelligent alien life, becoming one of the earliest members of the Galactic Republic, even having a Chancellor around 11,987 BBY. Over the centuries, most species became well aware that the stereotypical Bothan was incredibly intelligent, cunning, and ambitious, the result of an entire culture that, even in this spacefaring age, never forgot the mindset that liberated them from the deadly beast of their homeworld. They kept the same basic social structure for millennia, having families that were organized into clans, with a Bothan name having 3 separate names: the given name, family name, and clan name. One of the most notable clans was Stone Clan, which produced the cultural hero Golm Furzja, who would have been the equivalent of a prophet to more religious species, writing a collection of wisdom called The Way. One of the lines states, quote, "By your own hands you may prevent your own defeat, but the opportunity to defeat your rival is provided by the rival himself." It taught the ultimate self-control, ever vigilant to ways to advance oneself, then expanding this philosophy out to say that each Bothan should put their interest above all others, then their family above all other families, and clan before all other clans. There was not a plurality of religions or competing philosophical beliefs in the Bothan zeitgeist. Instead, just about every one of them lived by the Way, for countless generations, even into the age of the Old Republic. But the Way absolutely forbid violence. The Bothan Council, which had 18 members from each of the nation-states that arose out of the regional clan alliances, and then eventually their colonies, would act as the operating government for all of Bothan space, and enforce the strict policies concerning individual weapon ownership. And in line with the Way, they never created a space naval force, instead investing in the best planetary shields money could buy, though there was a small defense force for the Council. So while they put their species above all others, as they expanded, they quickly saw that all of those other species were willing to use warships, blasters, and proton torpedoes to gain their power. Bothans realized that after all of this great technological progress, they had returned to the same landscape of their forefathers, now a cosmic jungle, all hoping to devour the diminutive, weaponless Bothans. Again, they would rely on their intellect. As the galaxy was seeing an explosion of growth as more and more cultures were incorporated into the Republic, this era saw the development of complex networks of hyperspace lanes, which were then used to wage galactic-scale wars. Manufacturers like Hutt drive yards and Rendili star drives would pump out warships, while the Bothans became synonymous with intel. The Bothan Spy Net was not a single entity, but a term for the loosely associated Bothan clans that engaged in every form of surveillance, espionage, and theft to gain intel that could be sold off to pirates, bounty hunters, militias, planetary governments, and eventually even the Republic and Sith Empire. They had no alliances, selling to both sides of every conflict, as Bothan data-gathering techniques were almost never directly uncovered. No one could point to exactly how they got the intel, but everyone knew that if they made enemies of these furry slicers, their deepest and darkest secrets would be exposed. And thus, without a powerful military presence, the Bothan-held worlds would remain unscathed by the wars that set most star systems ablaze. Even places like Rendili and Kuat would see invasions, but not Bothawai, all thanks to the Spynet and that powerful shield. Everyone knew that anyone who initiated an invasion would trigger the Spynet to carry out a complete data purge and hacking campaign. The invaders' information would be released to all of their enemies, giving up everything from the homes of politicians' family members to technical data on starships or landing codes for bases. The Bothans made sure the galaxy knew that any attack on them would result in mutual destruction. The invaders' territories would be plunged into chaos, ripped apart by the information that the Bothans provided to the enemy of their enemy. And because of this, Bothawai had only been attacked once by the 23rd Pius Dea Crusade back before those massive shields were in place. And then after the shield's creation, the only force crazy enough to attempt an invasion would be the Sith Empire, and at the time that most would consider to be at their peak of Imperial power. An empire that was also incredibly well hidden and not involved in most of the galaxy at large, during the Great Galactic War from 3681 BBY to 3653 BBY. One of the most intense moments was during the Battle of Bothawai, where their homeworld was assaulted multiple times, with the Republic blockade fleet holding off the first wave, then the shield preventing a major invasion, and then a third wave had a strike team deliver over 50,000 troops drop to the surface via an armada of smaller craft, intent on destroying the shield generator from the surface. A single Jedi Master named Balthalusis, his 84 knights, and only 4,000 Republic troops were able to hold the Sith forces off, killing 40,000 of them before finally being overwhelmed. Though when the smoke cleared, the invaders realized that in this fighting, their means of destroying the shield generator had also been lost. And Moff Zealous' devastating losses on this world are believed to have cost him his life, as the Moff was never heard from again, last seen making his report on the Battle of Bothawai to the Emperor. As you can see, the Republic was unwilling to lose this world, and as the war died down over the millennia, Bothawai became an ever-increasing economic center, being located in the Slice, the junction of 4 major hyperlanes. This made it a great center for megacorporations and communications arrays, both excellent vectors for the growing power of the Bothan Spy Network. The matter-of-factness that the Bothans had towards espionage spread through the corporate culture, and spying became just another cost of doing business. The Bothan Council promoted this behavior and kept low taxes and minimal regulations to entice businesses to the more free, open, and safer mid-rim rival of Coruscant. As more and more species became accustomed to seeing Bothans in the boardroom, keen students of these people knew to keep an eye on their fur when negotiating, because the Bothans had a trait called Rendui, where their fur would have these gentle ripplings that were a response to their emotions. For thousands of years, the volatile forces known as the Sith seemed to have disappeared from the galaxy, and Bothans kept ensuring that they were the undisputed kings of intel. Long before the official start of the Clone Wars with the Battle of Geonosis in 22 BBY, Bothan Senator Polo Salab had been abstaining from votes that he felt were polarizing the galaxy, sensing that war was brewing, and vowing to remain neutral through the conflict, making them one of the few worlds to have been with the Republic for so long that did not either fiercely defend or oppose the 25,000-year-old galactic government. Their council established a Bothan Martial Academy, though these forces were often mocked for how weak and thoroughly unfrightening they were with a blaster. Though as you might expect, their slicing skills were greater than any force out there. The council directed the various clans of the Spynet on what intel should be released and to whom, in their attempt to guide this conflict towards a quicker end, being the only real great annoyance to the puppet master Palpatine throughout the length of the war. Though openly, he would often call on Count Dooku to meet for peace talks on Bothawai, this long-recognized neutral world to settle affairs with the greatest and most informed minds at the table. It is unclear what General Grievous intended with his invasion of the Both system, as this force would not have been able to penetrate the planetary shield, and the CIS had no wants of pushing the Spynet to work exclusively with the Republic. Likely this was to capture some world or asset within this area of the galaxy, and not Bothawai itself. Since we do see a separatist listening post nearby, perhaps they wanted to establish a similar outpost closer to the communications hub that was the Bothan system. When the Clone Wars came to an end with the establishment of the Galactic Empire, the Bothan Spy Net would continue to be a thorn in Palpatine's side. They worked with the new power, but as collectors of data, they knew more than anyone else that the horrifying genocidal accounts were true, that the Emperor was unlike any Supreme Chancellor before him, that each day that passed brought them closer to the inevitable declaration that Bothawai was too dangerous to be left independent. Aiding the nascent Rebel Alliance helped to tie up Imperial hands and force them to focus on this group instead of the Spy Net. Like every conflict before, the Bothans would play both sides, giving up useful information to Imperial MOFs that did lead to devastating blows to the Rebel Alliance, earning the Emperor's trust and some more years of freedom, while many members of the Spy Net were simultaneously helping the rebellion, helping train new slicers and encrypting their communications to rebel cells. By around the second decade of Imperial rule, the day finally came where a governor and a small garrison of stormtroopers were placed on Bothawai, but their council still did retain far more autonomy than most. When years later the first intel on a planet-killing superweapon were revealed, the Spy Net upped their efforts to aid the Rebel Alliance. Knowing their strategy of neutrality was impossible, with an Imperial governor overseeing them, and a hyperspace-traveling space station that could blow through any planetary shield now at play. Legends say that it was the Bothans who delivered the codes for the first Death Star to an Imperial MOF defector, who got them into the hands of the Rebel Alliance. With the destruction of this moon-sized battle station, the resulting counterattack on Yavin 4 would see the death of 3 Bothans that had become rebel leaders. This was followed by the Emperor traveling to Bothawai with 2 royal guards, and personally killing hundreds of Bothans on their homeworld. Blood spilled on the streets of the capital of the world that for millennia had symbolized neutrality. All of Bothan society had turned on the Emperor after this, and the might of their galaxy-spanning spy net focused on any and all cracks in Imperial might. This included any attempts by the Empire to rebuild the Death Star, and 3 years later they finally picked up on a computer core containing top-secret Imperial construction blueprints disguised in a freighter-moving fertilizer. Luke Skywalker and Dash Rendar would lead a strike team on this freighter, ambushing them in the outskirts of the Both system, with 11 Y-Wings piloted by Bothans, 6 of whom would be killed, but the raid was a success, and the plans were decrypted by a Bothan team on one of their colony worlds, Kothlis. With Imperial forces hot on their trail, they were nearly intercepted, but did ultimately get those plans to the Mon Calamari starcruiser named Independence, into the hands of Admiral Akbar. The rebels scrambled to destroy this planet killer before it could be finished, since the plans showed that it was not yet defended. But Palpatine had played the Bothans, perhaps the only being in the galaxy that could outsmart them. He made this intel so difficult to find and highly encrypted that by the time that the Spynet revealed it, and after the best slicers in the galaxy collectively poured thousands of hours into getting these plans, they would never even consider that this was indeed the trap. Luckily, the Force was on their side, and over the moon of Endor, the Death Star would be destroyed along with the Empire. During the Civil War, they had created the Bothan Combat Response Element, a small fleet of stolen and reworked Imperial capital ships known as the Microfleet. Nothing of the Star Destroyer size, but this fleet was worked into the forces of the New Republic and used to protect Bothan space in the chaos of the collapsing Empire. Seeing how close the Empire had come at destroying them, the Bothans would start to build warships and maintain a military alongside their spy network. And like another great mind, Grand Admiral Thrawn, the Bothan brass advised the New Republic to create large fleets of smaller ships instead of the behemoths that were the Star Destroyers and SSDs. By 19 ABY, Bothawai would see waves of riots across the planet, secretly started by Imperial Remnant members. With the release of the Camus document, a supposedly declassified Imperial file, which implicated the Bothans in giving up intel that allowed the Empire to orbitally bombard the highly populated core world of Camus. Many NR allies turned on them, because of course there was truth to the claims that they were always playing both sides. But as the riots spread, some in the NR were keen enough to see that this chaos was covering up a secret operation to destroy the legendary planetary shield generators. Despite the efforts of Wedge Antilles and others, Imperial agents were able to pull off something the galaxy had long thought impossible, and actually shut down these planetary shields for some time, allowing for a planetary bombardment of this symbol of neutrality. But at the sight of Imperial ships, all forces knew they had been played, and the Bothans and their allies unified to destroy these remnant forces. Their military would grow even stronger after this, creating things like the Bothan assault cruiser, which would be in service during the Yuzong Vong War from 25 to 29 ABY. Conspiracies abound over why these alien invaders did not attempt to take Bothawai. It was of course heavily defended, but not nearly as much as Coruscant or some other worlds, and it was an incredibly important planet at a major hyperspace junction. But after this war was over, the Bothans were again a founding member of the new galaxy-spanning government, which rose from the ashes of the Vong War. By 40 ABY, the Second Galactic Civil War was led by Jacen Solo, and his ally, Sith Lady Lumaya, would convince the Bothans that the Alliance had turned against them, evoking the change from Republic to Empire, though at the end of the war they would return to the GA and continue to have a prominent role in the leadership and unofficial power structures. Nearly 100 years later, in 137 ABY, Darth Krayt had learned from the mistakes of his Imperial predecessors, and instead of using brute strength to take Bothawai, he conducted a slow process of buying off prominent Bothan leaders, eventually using his influence to get them to allow for the establishment of an Imperial intelligence base on their world. Though the vast majority of Bothans were against this, and once revealed, both peaceful protest and violent riots spread throughout the cities targeting Bothans that had sold out. And though we do not know the ultimate result of this, we can assume that before long the Bothans were back to their fierce independence, with the Spynet keeping their invisible intelligence empire in place as one of the longest running and most powerful organizations in galactic history. So that's it for their breakdown in history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The world was originally known as just Bothan's Planet, or Bothan. They were first mentioned in Return of the Jedi, though expanded upon and depicted in the novel Heir to the Empire in 1991. Though descriptions differ across sources from hairy human to longer-snouted dog-like creatures and things in between, while this creature in 1985's Star Wars Droids is thought to be a Bothan. A lot of post-Imperial details come from the novel Spectre of the Past, while other stuff comes from Shadows of the Empire sourcebook, Guide to Alien Species, the Complete Encyclopedia, X-Wing novel series, and the Essential Guide to Warfare. If you made it this far, please hit that like button, leave a comment about the video, or make a request for future video topics, and subscribe if you want to see more. But most important of all, remember, those incognito tabs didn't keep the Bothans out of your search history, so think twice before sending your invasion fleet, and the Force will be with you, always.
Not trying to swindle me, are you?
Hey, you're forgetting my finder's fee.
Mind trick's gonna work on me. Only money.
They should have explained that Toydaria is a neutral system.
What's up, meta nerds? This video is going to be a complete breakdown of the Toydarian species, looking at the world they evolved on, their biology, culture, history, and impact on the galaxy at large. Let's get back to the Toydarians. To start their story, we'll have to head to grid coordinates R11, located in the mid-rim, an area that has fallen within Hutt space for as long as maps like these have been charted. Toydaria revolved around a binary star system, being in the 4th orbital position with 3 moons and a diameter of 7,900 kilometers, making it about 67% the size of Coruscant, while having a normal day-night cycle, which lasted 21 hours. The world was covered in some mountains, but was mostly covered in thick swamps and fields of muck that stretched for hundreds of miles. The swamps were filled with a variety of fish, reptiles, and bugs, while everything was covered in thousands of types of algae and mushrooms. The first, and arguably still most successful product of evolutionary pressures, was the grab worm. It might not be an intimidating name, but it rocketed to the top of the food chain, becoming a 12-foot-long, streamlined predator that could effortlessly zip through thick muck, bodies of water, or up trees. Many species went extinct due to the grab worm, while those species that could fly now had a great advantage. The Toydarians are classified as mammals, and they have a general humanoid form as far as the limbs and sensory organs, even hair growing on the head, long eyelashes, and beards on the males. Their large eyes help them to see grub worms that were hunting them at night in the dark swamp forests, while the long snout helped to process smells and hold their prey in place, while their 3-fingered hands would guide mostly fish into their mouth, or would be impaled by these pairs of tusks on their upper and lower jaws. While their feet were webbed for walking over mucky terrain and swimming, and though their insect-like wings might seem too small for their apparent weight, they are actually a relatively light species. The problem is that to others they both look and act like gluttons. But what looks like a gut is actually a dense collection of spongy tissue that collects air from the environment and turns it into a lighter-than-air gas to help negate some of their weight. So not a potbelly, but a sort of organic blimp, and somewhat like a swim bladder in fish that can help them control their depth in water. This combined with their wings, which beat nearly 10 times a second, made it so they were rarely ever on their feet. But these wings also required a lot of energy, and Toydarians had a hyperactive metabolism, so they have what looks like a large gut and were often seen devouring enormous amounts of food, generating a negative stereotype amongst a lot of alien species. Being mammals, they would give live birth and emerge from their mothers fully formed and able to fly. It is unclear at what year they matured or were able to reproduce, but adults would reach a height of 1.2 meters or 4 feet, though with those wings they were able to get eye to eye with other taller species. And they actually lived slightly longer than many other humanoids, averaging 91 standard years. And as for their skin color, it could range from reds and oranges to blues and greens, with cream-colored stomachs, hands, and feet. There is one final oddity about their biology I want to mention before we get into their history, and it has to do with swamp fairies. Named Shaurin, these creatures provided the evolutionary pressures that resulted in Toydarians having a near-complete immunity to force mind tricks. They were tall and thin green amphibians, with similar spongy tissued bodies like the Toydarians, but they had leathery tendrils that would wrap around their prey and extract nutrients. They are also one of the rare species, like the Ysalmiri, Convor, Voxen, and Hissus, that evolved around using the Force. The Shaurin used it to create an illusion in the minds of their prey, appearing as a white, yellowish light that induced euphoria and a sense of friendship. The victim would black out while having their blood drained via these tendrils, all while thinking they were in the loving embrace of a swamp fairy. Some immunity to force mind tricks is due to someone's willpower, but in a lot of species it's actually on their biological makeup, the structure of their brain, and so genetic variation among their species was eliminated until only those Toydarians with a brain structure that prevented forced suggestions was all that remained within their species. These people would spend their lives hunting and foraging for edible algae and mushrooms, and occasionally waging intense clan wars on each other resulting from food shortages. They were so vindictive that if they were starving, they would often poison their neighbors' food supplies under a popular phrase that roughly translates to, "If we can't have it, no one can." They didn't even have standing armies or a warrior class, but this mentality was found all over the globe. It was something like a crusade where they would all get riled up and head out, but instead of any ideas of reclaiming something, it was simply to steal food and to destroy a rival's prosperous area. This was done for as long as they could remember, but it would also go away as quickly as it started, usually only happening once every 30 years. But once everybody had enough food, they would go back to being peaceful, and there are no accounts of lasting tribal feuds. No revenge for a previous attack, just this strange sense of moral outrage that their neighbor had food seems to be the only thing that spawned anger in them. And that might have been the most complex aspect of their civilization if it wasn't for the arrival of a powerful alien species. One fateful day, a flotilla of ships started to descend through the thick, foggy atmosphere. Massive, armored slugs started firing on the grabworms, while stunning crafts soared over the swamps. And metallic beings called droids listened to the screaming and confused Toydarians, driven into a panic by this alien invasion. These translator droids were able to decipher the native tongue and establish communication between them and the aliens called Hutts. The giant slugs said they came in peace and only wanted to share their technology and civilizational organization strategies. In fact, a Hutt leader named Zajin once said, quote, "Millennia ago, we were idolized by the younger species. We brought a golden age to 1,000,000 worlds." In fact, the Hutt Empire predates the Old Republic, and it did provide an instant galactic leap in technology. Modern cities and spaceports were built, while a feudal monarchy was established, with Hutts residing in these high-tech palaces, giving orders to the appointed Toydarian lords, which were just the elders of their clans. They were shown advanced farming techniques, utilizing the mineral-rich muck fields, and eventually they would grow enough that their census would show that their major exports are food and labor. Labor being a euphemism for the Hutts selling them into slavery, used in places where they could put those wings to good use. The Hutts did build a rail system for the Toydarians to travel from city to city, but this was in part because they were denied the use of any flying craft, while the Hutt lords floated over their subjects in their elegant caravels, like the Celestis II. It was easy to control this world as the only place to land were on these Hutt-made cities, as most ships would sink into the muck, and there were no big patches of dry, solid land. We can also assume that these cities likely had some sort of tech that would keep the grabworms from slithering up out of the muck. Under this Hutt leadership, they would spawn major cities like Arnell, Riar, Royal City, and Toydor, getting up to a population of 11 million, being 79% Toydarian, 18% Hutt, and 3% other, including those that served the Hutts. Over time, their Hutt overlords refined their ruling strategies, allowing Toydarians to rule as king, and to fill up the lower noble positions, using a pretty widespread strategy at preventing revolts by having your rulers look like your subjects, while in reality all of these nobles still reported to the Hutts. One of these new faces was Baron Real, who would have to oversee all of the changes in property ownership from one Toydarian to another, while still having the royal right to take ownership of anything. And although he was loved by the people and adamant that he was independent of any Hutt influence, he would funnel materials to certain Hutt criminals, and even let them use the royal guard when they visited cities on world. Criminal elements were drawn to the hallucinogenic mushrooms found in the swamps. The most loved were the gray and black Gabbaki shrooms, which grew out of the droppings of the Shaorin, the swamp fairies. The gray ones would be dried, and when lit it would burn in a beautiful color, and release a smoke that most species found relaxing and euphoric. It wasn't incredibly strong or addictive, and most cantinas would use it sort of like a CBD incense, burning it in the front of stores to make patrons more calm, happy, and pliable to salesmen. But the black Gabbaki was a form of spice, making this one of the few sources of natural spice in the galaxy, the largest being on Ryloth. This was turned into Neutron Pixie, one of the most powerful drugs in the galaxy, a hallucinogenic spice that gave an ecstatic feeling, increased reaction time, greater resistance to pain, and perceived increases in strength and endurance, while its crash induced heavy sweating, nausea, body sores, and deliria. To process this drug, it needed to be immediately flash frozen, as it would wither and lose its spice potency within hours. This was a great boon to the Hutt drug network, and it became so popular that it was flavored by a variety of fruits loved by all sorts of species. And since it grew out of fairy dung, it was incredibly dangerous for alien species who were unaware of the Shaorin's horrors. So the Hutts established holoprojector warnings to protect exotic game hunters who might venture out there. But this was great luck for the Hutts, since they were also immune to force suggestion like the Toydarians. It would simply blast the tentacled horrors, not being tricked into seeing them as some etheric light beings. Interestingly, Watto went out of his way to maintain a Naomis flower, keeping it in a climate-controlled chamber that mimicked the damp swamps of home. It is unknown the significance that this had for him, but we can assume that it was probably very valuable, and possibly a source of rare spice or a medicine. Because of their serfdom to the Hutts, they were able to stay neutral in most galactic conflicts that swept the galaxy, including the Clone Wars. The one time they made an exception, with King Katunko allowing the Republic to build a base within Toydarian territory, Dooku dispatched Savage Opress to respond, delivering a brutal, public, and disrespectful death. Even under the Empire, there was no real Imperial presence on Toydaria, as the Hutts agreed to respect Palpatine as the true ruler of the underworld, knowing they would leave the Hutts to manage it all as long as they did what he asked. But when the Yuuzhan Vong invaded, they would take this world on their push through Hutt space and into the core, though they never really did get a strong foothold, as all the Toydarians sprung into a flying, guerrilla-fighting frenzy. Taking the foggy swamps was nearly impossible, and the grab worms that had shaped their very biology by devouring all those who could not fly were now becoming the inadvertent heroes of Toydaria, as they struck like lightning, Vong being hit and dragged into the mud in the blink of an eye. While under the New Republic, the Hutts were never really on good terms with those righteous leaders, and again Toydaria would remain isolated and secure. And the Toydarians went back to their timeless fight, keeping off negative stereotypes as being gluttonous, underworld-connected slobs. So that's it for their breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. The Toydarians have one of the most dichotomous images in the minds of fans, being the gross evil Watto that kept little slave Annie, and the bounty broker Roz, who was beloved by Jango and all of us who met her. It was a strange religious group, the Church of Toydaria, which ran ads on Coruscant reading, "Why? Why not? Not everything is black and white," seeming to imply it promoted some sort of moral relativity, but it is unclear if it was created by the Toydarians or Offworlders. Maybe they simply used the difficult, remote terrain to meditate, but perhaps they even risked communing with the fairy spirits. I could see it very plausible that some force-immune species like the natives could take naive Offworlders, let them experience these seemingly supernatural fairy creatures, whisking them away before they were devoured, and then hitting them up for donations. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Their species was introduced with Watto, and their planet was first shown in the Clone Wars episode Supply Lines. While a lot of details came from the Essential Guide to Alien Species, Complete Locations, Atlas, and Guide to Warfare, as well as the role-playing guide Edge of Empire, Lords of Nalhutta. But most important of all, remember, not all Toydarians make bets thinking they just sent a child to their fiery death. Some also sell addictive mushrooms, and trick rich Coruscanti kids into thinking they had a religious experience by exposing them to Swamp Cthulhu. and the Force will be with you. Always. From thousands of years of bloody clan warfare, a global dictator that only let the strongest warriors leave their homeworld, only to still have cowardly Rhodian stereotypes spread, though these people would produce one of the longest and greatest bounty hunting traditions, using their dangerous homeworld as a way to strengthen their species. What's up, meta nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of the Rhodian biology, history, culture, and impact on the galaxy over 20,000 plus years. The story of the Rhodian species starts at grid coordinates R16 on the galactic map. Their homeworld of Rhodia was on the fringes with neighbors like Tatooine and Geonosis. I always like to mention that any humanoid species could be suspected of being artificially created by the Celestials or the Rakata. But without any direct evidence, we'll just assume that they evolved naturally on this world, which was almost completely covered in jungles and swamps, having the Type 1 atmosphere that was breathable to most species, but also being incredibly hot to most off-worlders. Their ancestors would try to pass on their genes before being devoured by the likes of 10-foot-long cancels swooping down on them, the land-dwelling horrors of the 20-foot guests, aka swamp demons that were known to swallow up entire villages, a creature that so struck at the core of Rhodian fears that they took on mythological properties, believed to be able to take souls to the afterlife. They were alongside the Nuangol, which were Rancor-sized arachnids, and minivan-sized car stags whose armor was nearly impenetrable, and which could take you out with the flick of their spiked tail. While the seas almost guaranteed death, with the Leviathan-like Vapors and Quasal Maw, which was nearly the size of a football field. These environmental pressures shaped the modern Rhodian, giving them their tough, mostly green to yellowish skin which camouflaged in the vegetation. There were some very rare instances of blue, white, and red Rhodians, but this was due to what was considered a whole-body birthmark, and was so rare that individuals usually had this odd phenomena attached to their names, like the infamous Navik the Red, who was fittingly a feared warlord. Their eyes were the result of nocturnal hunting, having large compound eyes which were most often seen in insects and crustaceans. Being a series of thousands of individual ommatidia, each of these little hexagons being like their own little eye, corneas, cones, pigment and photoreceptor cells, and their own optic nerve. At this size, and in the right lighting, these eyes had this beautiful star-field glow, and had the functional purpose of allowing the Rhodian to process a greater range of the electromagnetic spectrum, and of course gave them an overall drastically different visual experience than most other humanoid species. This allowed them to see into the infrared spectrum, detecting the body heat of prey and predators hiding in the dense bush, as well as see the tracks that creatures recently left behind. While they also had these small saucer ears that could independently turn towards sounds and focus the vibrations into these cones, in addition to the standard, more human-like ears on the side of their head. Their long snouts helped in a variety of ways, filtering out toxins and airborne pathogens of the swampy environment, as witnessed by some of the sicknesses that would overcome some off-worlders, and it gave them the ability to harmlessly breathe in air that was filled with a fuel known as Cluzon 36. But it also helped them to detect different animal smells with an incredible accuracy, as well as the pheromones of other Rhodians. The pheromones were emitted through their skin in an oil that had a pungent, musky odor, and sexual competition and insecurity developed as some males would exude stronger smells than others, and they could tell if a female was being moistened with more oils if they were actually attracted to someone. To other species, they all smelled the same, which was unanimously described as horrendous, and it was often difficult to be near them, but to Rhodians, the smells were as different as someone's voice, while also having the equivalent of accents, as a Rhodian could easily detect what region another Rhodian was from based on this different smell, knowing what clan they were from and so on, all from this pheromone secretion. At times of war with each other, this non-maskable, passive emission of pheromones would drive them into a frenzy when enemies were nearby. These pheromones being like transmittable hormones, directly affecting the mind of each other like a boost of anger or stress-causing chemicals in the brain. Now, although almost all other species were disgusted by the pheromone-infused oil on their skin, the Hutts actually loved a drink made from this substance, and one opportunistic bartender on Tatooine put Greedo's corpse to good use, stripping the green skin off, blending it and distilling it into a potent liquor. Moving to their hands and feet, their fingertips and toes end in these suction cup-like structures that allowed them to scale up the slime-covered trees of the swamps, but also worked on wood, stone, and later even artificial structures. One of the mysteries of this species is why some have a smooth head, while others have a crest of spines or even hair. The hair variation appears most often in females, but not exclusively, and both the hair and spines can also vary in volume, length, and color. Women also had human-like breasts and mammary glands, and though many female Rhodians would look and dress the same as men, there were some that tried to focus on their feminine features in hopes that they could make credits through their sex appeal. though this was never as successful as their rivals the Twi'leks. Now, similar to primates, Rhodians had a large web of evolutionary relatives with varying levels of similar traits and intelligent lizard-like species, some bipedal and others on all fours, but the Rhodian intelligence advantage exponentiated over thousands of generations to make them the undisputed dominant species, developing large settlements along major rivers and producing weapons and technology that could finally give them the advantage over the predators that had plagued their ancestors. One of the earliest known historical terms similar to hero was Guest Slayer, Rhodians powerful enough to finally start hunting down the demons that used to devour their souls. These creatures would be made nearly extinct, as well as many other predators in the land, air, and even seas. As clans grew, the threats no longer came from the jungle, but from other Rhodians. And the clan warfare on Rhodia would be constant for thousands of years, reaching brutality that rivaled the worst horrors of the galaxy. And just as the beasts gave rise to the Rhodian species, these pressures worked to further refine one great clan to rise as leaders of the whole of Rhodia. When the Soami clan developed technology powerful enough to declare itself the Insta Sirinna, or Grand Protectors of the Rhodians. This first, globally dominant clan would diffuse tech to others, resulting in power eventually shifting to other clans over the centuries, but it was always a dictatorship. Around 15,000 BBY, alien craft would set down on Rhodia and be immediately hunted down. The high-tech visitors suffered in the hot, thick atmosphere and had countless casualties in the night raids launched by the bug-eyed natives. Eventually, the Grand Protector realized these aliens had remarkable technology and gave the order to show them peace. With the use of an AI program within droids, they were able to act as translators between Basic and Rhodian, the aliens expressing that they came in peace as representatives of the Galactic Republic, a cooperative, democratic government that tried to unite thousands of species into one body. A Grand Protector at a galactic scale. The Rhodian leader realized this was a new dynamic that would force a change on his people, and he hoped to channel their violence into a commodity for the galactic market. Rhodia saw an instant technology jump, quickly mastering spacecraft, power systems, and shield generators, though best of all were the energy weapons. Blaster rifles and thermal detonators were quickly mastered, and their leader shifted clan rivalries into gladiatorial contests, erecting stadiums across Rhodia to challenge fighters to make a name for themselves, while also having contests to find the greatest big game hunters and bounty hunters. The best of these received awards called the Atiang, which held the prestige of something like a Nobel Peace Prize or Medal of Honor, but for categories like Best Shot, Longest Tracking, and Most Notorious Capture. As absolute dictator, the Great Protector decided to prevent all immigration off-world. The only Rhodians the galaxy would ever see were these Atang champions, whose services were hired out by militias and bounty hunting organizations across the galaxy. Over time, these gladiator games were further expanded to include theater, which itself started only as choreographed fighting, but grew to involve more complex plots to become more like plays. And to the outrage of the dictator, this spawned the first deep philosophical and political commentary, the only veiled way that Rhodians could challenge their GP and the local bureaucrats that enforced the central authority. As their civilization grew, some historically weaker clans hoped to find salvation on a starship, and risked their lives to seek out smugglers that would illegally take them off-world. Their GP was outraged at this move that insulted him, and showed the galaxy what he considered to be the worst of Rhodian species. His goal to provide the galaxy with an image of Rhodians that was only based on the gladiatorial heroes was undermined, and he was able to use propaganda to paint these fleeing clans as the worst forms of traitors. Death would be all that awaited them if they ever returned home, and over time all saw off-world born Rhodians as effectively an alien species. And knowing how specialized their pheromone detection was, we can imagine that over the centuries it became easy to detect an off-worlder, as they would be chemically speaking not just with an accent, but now a whole alien language. Despite their violent history, and having bounty hunters and trackers as their major export, the GP did not use this muscle to hunt down those who fled their homeworld, at least not publicly, though we could imagine that if any forces on-world tried to change policies, or if these off-worlders spread critiques of their old leader, then one of these assassins might pay them a visit. As the Republic grew to spread into more regions of the galaxy, developing the mid and outer rims, they started to develop a deeper and deeper relationship with the most evil and ancient practice, slavery. Almost every species had practiced it at some point, and though the Republic and Jedi Order patted themselves on the back for removing slavery from the core, many of the goods that were imported from these less regulated areas of space were often produced by cartels that utilized slave labor, while some core worlders would travel out to these regions to enjoy the services provided by all sorts of slaves. Rhodia never hosted slave markets or drew on slave labor, but the GP was proud to advertise that his elite hunters and trackers are the best in the galaxy at procuring slaves, subduing a population, or reclaiming any runaway products. These same individuals would work with the Republic military and Jedi for certain missions, something that destroyed the trust and was not forgotten by many regions of the galaxy, which millennia later would secede to join the CIS. And although Rhodia was located near the Corellian-run Super Hyper Route, one of the most stable and lucrative highways in the galaxy, their homeworld was not conducive to major farming or mining. So this world would remain relatively poor, having only those hired guns sending back credits, and exporting some materials like exotic plants and animals only found here, while the only real industry was the production of luxury goods, importing fine raw materials like gems, metals, and fabrics in order to make clothing and jewelry at a great markup. The Rhodians that emigrated were often found in the lower rungs of society, as the Great Protector's scheme to create a stereotype of their species being a strong, cutthroat warrior ended up making it so that many saw their species tied to the underworld, like the Hutts. And as the reputation of Rhodian hired guns spread, they would indeed become courted by the Hutts, making a circular scenario where off-world Rhodians that weren't bounty hunters got drawn into the life, as they did all have a long cultural history with violence, and people often assumed that they were skilled and more readily welcomed them into gangs and security roles. The Hutts and the Republic became the two biggest employers of Rhodians, and these slugs would become one of the most populous alien species to live on Rhodia, though the amount of alien settlers never became too great in number, as even by the time of the Clone Wars, the population was 1.3 billion Rhodians, with only 100,000 aliens on world, which were mostly Hutts and their employees or business partners. Even with all this violence and evil on Rhodia, the species maintained a deep connection to the Force, and there were a great number of Rhodian Jedi throughout the Old Republic era and onward. Some of them would fight in the Great Sith War of 3996 BBY, though their homeworld was conquered by a Sith and Mandalorian alliance. A generation later, in 3976 BBY, the Mandalorian Wars would break out and the Rhodians tried to stay neutral, but they were eventually drawn into the Jedi Civil War of 3959. Rhodian scouts and assassins were such a problem for the Sith Empire that they hoped to use the Starforged fleet to turn their swamps into molten rock. They sustained planetary bombardment. Luckily, Jedi intel got to the Republic military, and they were able to scramble their own fleet to intercept. Rhodia would stay a loyal ally to the Republic from here on out, though Rhodian mercenaries would still work with the Sith, some being the descendants of those runaway clans, with hopes of returning home as conquerors. For the next 300 years they would have peace, but when the Sith blitzkrieg took Coruscant and forced the Treaty of Coruscant, the galaxy was split into two and their Outer Rim homeworld was forfeited to the Empire. Ambassador Marish was outraged at the ease at which they were given up by their longtime ally. A government that had always used the fear of the Sith to draw support from the Rhodians was now leaving them to be ruled by these bitter enemies. But there was truly nothing any of these parties could do to oppose this. For thousands of years, the Sith would continue to rule them, though their connections with the Hutts remained lucrative, and these people would never see anything like genocides, mass slavery, or environmental destruction at the hands of the Sith. When that Dark Order seemed to have been completely removed from the galaxy in 1000 BBY, Rhodia and the Republic were back to being allies, and would remain so even during the Separatist Crisis. During this time, we'd see an expression of greeting where they place open palms on their shoulders, developed out of their long and brutal history as warring clans. This, much like a handshake, was a gesture to show how you were not armed. This species, historically seen as synonymous with violence, was now becoming known as the anti-war party within the Senate. Even as separatist fever spread throughout the Senate in the 30s BBY, and despite being an Outer Rim people, having been abandoned by the Old Republic, they were still passionate supporters of unity, though their most trying time would come during the first months of the Clone War in 22 BBY, when Senator Anaconda Farr temporarily allied with the Separatists, after Newt Gunray was able to convince him that the Rhodians had again been abandoned, after communications and major supply lines to this world were cut off. Gunray delivered goods that the Republic could not, but Padme was eventually able to convince her old pacifist friend that he was being manipulated by the Viceroy. This would lead to Newt's arrest, and Farr would work on the Council of Neutral Systems to fight for worlds that did not want to be drawn into the war, while also opposing all expansions of the military, and constantly hosting representatives sent by Dooku, hoping to plant seeds of peace. These attempts were all used by the Umbaran and Kaminoan representatives to insinuate that the anti-war party was just a separatist plant to weaken the Republic, that the Rhodians never truly turned away from the CIS, And one scandal that was almost completely covered up was how Farr bribed the senator from Iceno to relocate his Republic fleets to Rhodia, while Duro was under imminent threat from Dirge. Rhodia was often at the front lines of conflict, but this movement away from Duro led to one of the most devastating CIS attacks of the entire war, when the planet was devastated during the infamous Operation Dirge's Lance. Toward the end of the war, the senator would be killed by his own aide, who felt that the senator's actions proved he was too weak to help keep them independent from this conflict. When the Clone Wars came to an end and the Empire sought to consolidate its power, the Rhodians' history of having the galaxy's best hunters kept them free from enslavement. Instead, they would be used to track down dissidents and try to snuff out the embers of the early rebellion. 2 years later, in 17 BBY, Navik the Red of the Chatsa clan would lead an astounding coup, taking the capital and installing himself as a dictator, the new Great Protector. But the Empire did not intervene, as he vowed to remain an ally, and he would keep providing useful intel and hunters, while also building a better relationship with Black Sun, and opening up Rhodia to trade like never before. Navik would also hunt down any historic rivals to his clan, worried that one of them would give rise to another ambitious youth like himself, who would be utterly unwilling to serve an ancestral enemy, and even used his hunters to kill entire clans that were currently living off-world. One of these was the Tetsu clan, and Greedo the Elder was slain before his pregnant wife. That child in the womb would grow to become Greedo, the famed bounty hunter often seen in the service of Jabba the Hutt, though he too would live out the time-honored Rhodian tradition of being killed in blaster fire. Many downtrodden Rhodians that didn't pick a life of crime were seen helping the Rebel Alliance. And when the New Republic took over, the warlord Navik the Red was Rhodia's first senator. Because of its location on the Corellian Run, during the Use and Vong War of 25 ABY, Rhodians would finally see mass enslavement at the hands of these extragalactic conquerors, and they hoped to use their ability to shape organisms on the Rhodians. As the Vong's own ships were bioengineered devices, Master Shaper Tong Malo used this ability to alter the Rhodians at a genetic level to produce the Vog Rhodiac. This species that had fought for millions of years against the beasts of the jungles and swamps was now being spliced with them, transforming them into the most horrifying monsters to ever terrorize Rhodia. Crafted into mindless slaves, racing on these crab-like legs and wielding meter-long scythe arms. These abominations were also dropped in on Hutt-controlled worlds, one of the longest allies to the Rhodians being cut to shreds by these freakish creations. All of Rhodia was further terraformed. Swamps became city-sized, leathery blossoms that spawned useful materials and creatures for the Vong Empire. Even after the war came to an end, many Vong holdouts were spread across the planet, and the Rhodians that had been able to survive by hiding in the deepest and darkest swamps were now slowly coming out to launch ambushes on the invaders. Though they could fight off the last of the Vong, the effects of their terraforming and genetic experiments was permanent. Rhodia was considered one of the most dangerous worlds in the entire galaxy, but these warrior people saw it as a great challenge. Their whole world was one massive gladiator arena, and where that had been used by the Great Protectors to produce the best of the best, Rhodians were now proud to say that they were able to carve out a society in this horrific setting. And most other species agreed with the results, as the galaxy saw them to be even greater hunters and warriors than ever before. And though they would have representation in the New Republic, when the galaxy again plunged into war with the rise of Darth Krayt's empire, the Rhodians were able to stay mostly neutral, taking up bounties on anyone, and in the process racking up more Jedi kills than any other group, earning the surprise and praise of one of the greatest Sith Lords to ever reign. So that's it for the Rhodian species, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The creature, the Quazzle Maul, was based off original trilogy concept art from Ralph McQuarrie. There was a deleted scene in episode 1 that shows a young Greedo fighting with Anakin, and later being counseled by an older Rhodian named Wald, played by Warwick Davis, who warns that if Greedo does not learn to control his temper, he would meet a violent end. These characters in the Mos Eisley Cantina were called Martians or Plutonians, and then later known as Morcerians. And they used a lot of the same parts that were in Greedo, but of course for Greedo they went down to 2 arms. Greedo's costume actually changes drastically from wide to close-up shots, and it's sad to hear that even the great creator himself was subject to the classic speciesism that liked to see the Rhodians as the killers, as original footage shows that Greedo never even fired a shot before the bloodthirsty human blasted him. In all seriousness, this is one of the most changed scenes in all of Star Wars. Definitely one of the most important ones that had a major fan reaction. And even after Lucas saying that Greedo shot first, there's actually the canon Disney novel A New Hope, The Princess, the Scoundrel, and the Farm Boy that, like the original scene, does not have Greedo getting a shot off at all. And when asked if this was on purpose, the author repeated that Solo fired before Greedo could get a shot off. The terms Rodian and Rodia were first introduced for the Star Wars Role-Playing Guide, released in 1989, and they were further expanded upon in the Essential Guide to Warfare, the Atlas, and Guide to Alien Species. But most important of all, remember, that filthy human Han shot first, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, meta nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of the Trandoshan species, from their homeworld, biology, culture, and impact on the galaxy, as well as ending on some behind-the-scenes facts. Trandoshan is actually a basicification of the word Todoshak, which is what these lizards called themselves in their native language of Dosh, which is also their name for their homeworld. The mid-rim planet registered as Trandosha at grid coordinates P9, located within the Kashyyyk system. Kashyyyk is the name of this system's sun, but also the name of the planet that is home to the Wookiees. This star system had 1 sun and 8 orbitals, which combined had at least 57 moons, which all made for a very active sector of an otherwise quiet part of space. Their homeworld was covered in oceans and dense jungles and forests, though there were some large areas of sun-baked deserts called the Scorch. Deadly predators arose under the waters and beneath the shade of the trees, things like enormous jellyfish, sharks, frisked wolves, and other lizard-like creatures that the Trandoshan evolutionary ancestors fought against for millennia, forging the sentient, cold-blooded, dominant species we see today, which reached 42 million individuals, being at all times throughout their history around 99% Trandoshan. They would hatch from eggs in groups of usually 4 siblings that would be called clutchmates, and this nest would be in warm places in their home or in the Scorchlands. As soon as they emerged from the egg, they were able to walk and hunt on their own, though most parents would keep them in some protected area like their homes to keep them away from the endless predators of their homeworld. Indoors, their natural hunting instinct would express itself in constant play. If a mama Trandoshan would ever let an outsider into their home during this time, you would have seen little lizards chasing each other all around the house, hiding and pouncing on each other at all times of the day and night. They would rapidly mature, developing a skin that was smooth to the touch but thick and scaly, usually in hues of tan, brown, and green, though there was a very rare bluish variant, with limbs that ended in these 3 large digits tipped in razor-sharp claws. These hands and feet made it difficult for them to use many types of blasters, weaponry, or even daily items, and clothing that was often made for humanoids with hand and feet a lot closer to humans. This is why they'll often be seen not wearing any shoes, as finding ones that fit was often difficult, and most Trandoshans felt that shoes were useless and just took away from their dexterity, with their thick scales providing plenty of protection walking on any terrain or metal surface. Their eye color ranged from yellow, orange, or red, and allowed them to see in the infrared range, perfect for hunting other saurians into the dark jungles. Joining the hunt from an early age, most parents would take their 2-year-olds out for their first hunt, and by the age of 10, most were proficient in unarmed combat as well as melee weapons and firearms. While being considered younglings until they were 11, young adults until 15, and being adults from 15 to 35, reaching their average height of 2 meters or 6 foot 7 inches, making them taller than most humanoids but still shorter than Wookiees. They were over the hill at just 35 years old, elderly at 50, and if a Trandoshan ever lived past 60, this was considered venerable and a sort of blessing by the Scorekeeper. The Scorekeeper was a female deity worshipped all across Trandosha. She was a being outside of space and time that enforced a morality that revolved around the hunt, rewarding individuals with Jagannath points for individuals related to the hunt. A cynical interpretation of this belief wonders if it was put in place by some early Trandoshan political power in order to direct a people bubbling with murderous energy, sending them out towards animals and other sentient species instead of towards each other. It seems that the Trandoshans developed space travel before first contact with the Republic, as their feud with the Wookiee people is treated like a cultural constant by both species, as if it had been going on for longer than anyone could remember. The Scorekeeper was said to heavily reward the killing of Wookiees, and coincidentally the Trandoshan economy loved the trade in Wookiee pelts, as these soft, warm, and stylish garments were loved by the many different species that the Trandoshans traded with, but also themselves. Being cold-blooded creatures, it was a truly euphoric experience to sit in the sun covered in your hard-earned Wookiee fur coat. Silverback Wookiees brought on an extra sense of luxury and status, and the Scorekeeper rewarded even more points for these kills, while the most points were achieved by killing infamous Wookiees that had slain Trandoshan brothers. The raids from these alien lizard people becoming a major part of Wookiee culture, and both cultures bred fierce warriors, each growing stronger in time as this feud created a sort of arms race, one that often resulted in Trandoshans literally losing their arms. These lizards were strong, but for a hairy species that could rip the arms off a Gundark, taking these hunters' arms was fairly easy. Bosk lost one of his arms to a Wookiee, and a slaver named So had both of his arms ripped off by the infamous hairball Chewbacca. And this wasn't even that embarrassing. In fact, he bragged about it as being the only one to fight Chewie and survive. You can see these small limbs growing back, like how most lizards can grow their tails and some reptiles can't even regrow their limbs. The Trandoshan was able to fully retain this ability even at a larger size, and after many months they would be fully replaced. Though this was painful, burdensome, and could lead to a Trandoshan being captured, tortured, or even killed by these Wookiees. So they would almost always hunt in packs with a massive arsenal of blasters, explosives, traps, and tools, knowing that if you came to Kashyyyk unarmed, you would leave de-armed. Worse is that if one was captured, they would lose all of their Jagannath points accumulated over their entire life. The only way to get these back would be to kill the one that captured you. If so, you regained all of your points plus some, and upon one's death, the Great Scorekeeper would place her warrior in a spot fitting of their status. Like a sort of Valhalla with multiple tiers, where great warriors could trade stories with their peers, only very few being able to sit at the legendary hero table, sharing a feast with the heroes of old across all time. The Trandoshans would join the Old Republic around 7000 BBY, and were fluent in both Basic and their native Dosh, being literate in both, though when speaking with each other, and especially on their homeworld, they would stick to Dosh, a writing system that had an alphabet comprised of lines and dashes. Now finding themselves in a galactic community, they started collecting Jagannath points from bounty hunting, mercenary work, or as raiding slavers.
Nothing worse than being taken alive to a Trando. Jagannath gets wiped, start from scratch, or die without an afterlife. Not what he wanted. Still did him a favor.
These people were not foodies, and even with a billion culinary options at their razor fingertips, they always preferred a bowl of live worms and a traditional flat cake made from plants from their home. Though they did develop a taste for alcoholic beverages like wine, which caused them to break out their ancient lizard dances that amused other species, often being the only ray of lightheartedness ever witnessed in these cold, violent beings. A dance that Bosk's father Kratos was known to perform in the bounty hunter guilds, where other hunters would learn that despite being rivals, the Trandoshans also shared the Wookiee practice of life debts. This was also seen with the Gungans, Nogri, and Tals, where one would pledge to protect the one that saved their life. Their term for this bond was a Grakowsk, and this was sometime taken advantage of, at least once by a Snivian species named Marn, who tricked Slisk into thinking he had rescued him from a piece of falling machinery. While the Trandoshans' favorite part of the galactic community were the tech wonders of droids and weaponry, they quickly replaced hard labor with X-10D draft droids, but only for those who had a high enough score, which on the worldly plane had to be mediated through the Elders, which of course involves some politics that we'll look at in a second. Though Bosk was one of those great enough to have one of these droids, which he kept on his ship, the Houndstooth. But the Elders said it was open season on any weapons that they wanted to get their hands on. Their natively developed weapons were the Accelerated Charged Particle Array Gun, as well as a Repeater and Gatling Gauntlet, all using a railgun-like technology to propel a solid projectile, making them one of the few people like the Tuskens to use solid rounds instead of energy balls like most blasters. Major companies picked up on these designs and made their own, developing new variants and bringing the style of the weapon into the modern era.
An energy weapon that looks like a slug thrower. I didn't think lizards were that nostalgic.
With many bounty hunters choosing these types of weapons to use on organics. Dirge loved the Gatling Gauntlet, and the advantage of these solid projectiles is that they better pass through some personal shield types, armor, and flesh, though an energy weapon was almost always better against droids. Many Trandoshans would end up buying from the legacy gunsmiths that dominated the galactic market, but those weapons were influenced from the Trandoshan designs. While many would also pick up the standard energy rifles and pistols, Bosk and his father would use a Relby V10 micro-grenade launcher, which was the best of both worlds. Being a solid projectile, but also a modern marvel of those aliens over at Blastech Industries that were able to turn something the size of a bullet into a micro-grenade, making it perfect for hunting the largest of game, and eliminating all kinds of targets and their armor, packing 55 micro-grenades into a standard magazine. For live captures, they used the Slave Master stun carbine, and the one weapon that was produced on-world and remained coveted by the Trandoshans and aliens alike were the Challen Ore blades. This Challen Ore is extremely rare and heavier and sharper than what most of the Republic's base was able to produce, being a double-bladed sword that was not a vibroblade, yet still proved viable in modern combat. During the Old Republic era, one Trandoshan named Kaizenfest was one of the few of his people to avoid the bounty and slaver path, and instead rack up favor with the Scorekeeper by hunting big game all across the galaxy, like his father before him, who died hunting crate dragons on Tatooine. He would hunt one wild beast in the Shadowlands of Kashyyyk for 3 weeks, before it somehow blinded him with a light burst in the infrared spectrum, followed by goring him and taking his eye. A little insight into the way they infused meaning into almost anything. He refused to get this fixed with modern tech, since this was a lesson from the Scorekeeper.
Why settle for being half-blind when there are substitutes available?
He would befriend a Jedi Master during the Galactic Cold War, and in their conversations we can get a deeper look into their mindset and culture. The Jedi would try to get him to see how killing the sentient Wookiees was wrong, but Kaizen's reaction was as if this was an incomprehensible claim.
The Wookiees are noble people, not animals for you to kill.
And we see that the Scorekeeper rewards those who visit the sites of great fallen hunters, with Kaizen wishing to go to his father's grave on Tatooine. During his time with the Jedi, he would undergo a ritual called Shikoyagu, which could be undertaken once they reach middle age, where they would fast, meditate, and keep physically training, sparking a complete replacement of their skin and growth of new muscle. Trandoshans would typically replace their skin cells over the course of a year, resulting in normal shedding, but this process was a much more deeply involved rebirth. A very painful process that for some marked the end of the hunting period of their life, and they would become elders to settle down and help run their society, as well as mentor younger hunters. But some would pass through this ritual and use their new strength to power their hunts for the rest of their lives. Kaizen mentions that he would drink Nakus leaf medicine on an empty stomach, which helps the skin to molt in this period of rebirth, though it induces vomiting, fever, and burning in the sinuses. In this time, the Scorekeeper sees them as neither dead nor alive, and thus unable to do anything that would affect anyone's score, leading him to withhold any advice to help fellow hunters, almost like a vow of silence on all things related to the Great Hunt. To prove they understand that all life feeds on other life, when they were reborn through this molting process, the final step was to eat their own flesh. The first meal in this new life was their own shedded skin. And Kaizen tells us that this dish sits like hard rocks in this long-fasted empty stomach. Shortly after he finished this ritual, he encountered a Wookiee named Gwawror who hated these lizard people, bragging that he had claimed the heads of more than 40 Trandoshans, killing them in their weakened state during their Shikoyagu. The Wookiee claims that it was payback for the Trandoshan tradition of turning Wookiees into pelts, something Kaizen admits without shame and says that he had personally done. After he kills the Wookiee, they learn that there was a Trandoshan that was working with this Wookiee to get their own people killed, something that shocked the Jedi, but Kaizen's calm understanding of this shows that this must not have been unheard of. He just says that for some, credits are enough reason to turn against their people and the Scorekeeper. Like all sentients in the galaxy, there were of course a spectrum of beliefs across individuals, and Veneb Drask was one that did not adhere to their cultural norms. To make it worse, this Veneb was a clan elder, and by using this Wookiee to kill off his rivals, he had grown strong alliances and was about to become a clan speaker. This made for a theological issue, getting at the very nature of the Trandoshan god, as Kaizen struggled with the issue that justice now saw Veneb as prey, but his success and growing power was seen as proof that the Scorekeeper was favoring him. It may seem simplistic, but success in gaining power was the strongest evidence for the will of the Scorekeeper. If you were doing bad, you didn't have her favor, and if you were doing well, she must have favored you. So speaking against a powerful elder was by definition to disagree with the will of their god. Kaizen declaring, what could he say? I am judge? I am wiser? He knows that many elders would respond that this was not his concern, that those in his rank should just focus on gathering more points. But he thought, prayed, and issued a Grajath, which was a formal dispute which would have to be resolved between the two parties before Veneb could be promoted. This could be hashed out with words or violence, and whoever wins would take the other's points. Veneb denies everything, but snaps at one of his men when they worry about the Jedi. shouting to remember his teaching that no one controls them, not the Jedi or Scorekeeper. This was the ultimate blasphemy, and he goes on to explain that they grew tired of serving her. They created their own morality and would hunt others to serve themselves. The Jedi sees the parallel to his own order and the Sith who broke away, and in the inevitable battle, this deceiver would be struck down, and his men wanted to join Kaizen, forming their own clan with him as their clan leader. This is a process that had likely happened countless times over the millennia, as one leader fell away from the path for one reason or another. Other things we learn from Kaizen is that he says most ships will refuse to take on Trandoshan passengers for fear of violence, or charge more, or make them sleep in cargo holds, and he admits that so many of his people reinforce this stereotype that he kind of understands why it's a good rule of thumb. But he is glad that a Jedi took favor of him and saw that he was different. And when he talks, we hear Trandoshans use the term hatchling or soft thing as an insult, while their belief in the Scorekeeper expanded into abstract concepts like ignorance or justice, producing hunting-based verbiage like one should stalk ignorance, and when speaking of one who deserves death, saying things like they were the prey of justice, that the hunt and the collection of Jagannath points was synonymous with righteousness and truth. But the Council of Elders was just the highest ring of a class system that was not rigid or obvious, but still stifling enough for some Trandoshans like the assassin Nakaron, who got himself banned from his hometown of Forak and then just about everywhere on Dosh for his disrespect, while others abandoned their Scorekeeper and their religious culture out of their obedience to the Jedi Order. One famous Jedi Trandoshan was Mursk, who died in 1032 BBY, a generation before the Sith Empire transformed into the Brotherhood of Darkness. It would be fascinating to hear what a Trandoshan thought of the Scorekeeper after they learned to embrace and live in the light side of the Force. We don't have any writings or holocrons from them, but they were all against violence, and perhaps thought the Scorekeeper was just a made-up myth created by the ruling class, or maybe that it was some sort of dark side manipulation, sort of dark side demon, or perhaps instilled on their people by some ancient Sith. In around 1000 BBY, when the Brotherhood of Darkness would rise to be the new United Sith Force, they would take control of the sector with two of the strongest and deadliest species by overwhelming Trandosha. Massive burnings of jungles and cities, devastating the homeworld, and using this system as a foothold. The next 1,000 years of history would be covered in darkness. By the time of the Clone Wars, the Trandoshans had become more isolated than ever, working in their same capacity to rack up points, usually associated with the underworld, while Trandosha's political representation in the Senate was, through all things, a Wookiee. Senator Yarua represented all of the Kashyyyk system, earning him hatred from both his scaled and furry constituents. At least one terrorist organization couldn't stand this, and Yarua was nearly killed by an assassination attempt by Trandoshans. By 22 BBY, the Clone Wars tensions exploded, and the historical violence and underworld connections of these lizard people combined with tons of actual Trandoshan mercenaries, slavers, and hunters working with the worlds that seceded, increasing the tensions between these people and the Republic. Some Trandoshans saw this war as a Jagannath point boom, and many CIS forces were aided by Trandoshan generals. The Acclamator class, the Prosecutor, was taken by a slaver leading a battalion of droids, a scene that played out countless times across the galaxy, culminating in the ultimate hunt. The full might of this technological superpower was used to appease the Scorekeeper in a crusade that promised to conquer the Wookiees completely. The invasion of Kashyyyk was a hunt and collection of Jagannath points on a scale their ancestors only dreamed of, especially with all the silverback Wookiee generals leading from the front. It was also during the Clone Wars era that Bosk would rise to become a galaxy-renowned bounty hunter working alongside the young Boba Fett, and Ahsoka would be hunted down in the time-honored tradition of collecting sentients to release into private game islands, on their Trandoshan moon of Waska. Garnak was the owner of Island 4, one of thousands of islands that would have been stocked with all sorts of game, and used both by the owner's own clan or to host alien hunters for a fee. One of the bucket list experiences for hunters of all species all across the galaxy, ignoring Republic law to hunt things from crates to Jedi, usually operating from the safety of their floating fortresses. When the Empire came to power, it was the greatest thing to ever happen to the Trandoshans, allowing them to act as slave camp operators and overseers of a program that would use the powerful Wookiee people that helped Yoda escape to build countless Imperial facilities, including parts of the Death Star. Bossk would work with countless individuals, including Ezra, but later mostly with the Hutt Empire and Darth Vader personally. This Imperial era would see Naka and his team hunting Wookiees on Kashyyyk, only to have all of his men killed by Black Chrysantan. Noka himself only surviving because he gave up info on his employers, that Black used to hunt them down as well. Feresk Zat was one of the few to fight in the anti-Imperial capacity, being a member of Vanguard Squadron in the New Republic after the Battle of Endor. While their bounty hunting tradition was as strong as always as late as 9 ABY, with these people filling up the ranks of the Bounty Hunter Guild. So that's it for the breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. There were a ton of visually different depictions of Trandoshans in media, from the movies to the games like Dark Forces and Republic Commando, even in the Clone Wars TV show. Because of this difference in the movies, they came up with a subspecies, the Saurans. A people whose lore has been expanded a bunch, and I hope to cover them one day, but they never directly say how they split. My best guess is likely through their own exploration of the galaxy, they were somehow cut off and evolutionary diverged in isolation. Or perhaps some were kidnapped and transferred by some other species in their distant past. One weird fact I wasn't sure what to do with is that the gravity on Trandosha is listed at only 0.62 standard, which would have been cool to see, and perhaps played a role in putting the Ahsoka hunted episodes on the moon instead. Also, Jagannath is a deity under Hinduism. It's a bit complicated, but the word itself apparently means Lord of the Universe, and is where we get our English word Juggernaut. A lot of details from this book come from the Essential Guide to Alien Species, Complete Locations, Guide to Droids, and the Alien Anthology. If you made it this far, the best way to help me out is to hit that like button, but most important of all, remember, it's okay to discriminate against giant violent lizards who all explicitly worship a murder deity. And the Force will be with you, always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of one of the strangest, complex, and horrifying species in the galaxy, the Sarlacc. Looking into its biology, semi-sentience, and connection to consciousness and perhaps the Force, as well as its impact on the galaxy and individuals that had run-ins with this hidden terror. We'll start at the beginning, Sarlacc conception. It's fascinating, but not to be viewed up close. These large, devouring ones we see are the females, while the males are much smaller, and roam an environment looking for a female to parasitically feed off of. It will attach to her and siphon off nutrients, and she will physically wither during this process. The original male will absorb the body of the female, to the point that she is considered devoured, but the spore production sac is retained intact. So really it is now a combined male-female creature, and releases its sperm equivalent into the equivalent of eggs absorbed by the female, as this melded couple being would now dedicate all effort to fertilizing these spores. The sac is growing in size and building up an incredible pressure, and keep in mind this entire process takes thousands of years from boy meets girl to parasitically feeding, and then the birth of the next generation, which is a dramatic and grotesque explosion that marks the death of this merged being in a bloody Sarlacc geyser, which shoots up out of the ground, projecting its fertilized spores miles up into the atmosphere, with enough power to actually escape most planets. The best Coruscanti biologists agree that the Sarlacc is one of the most ancient species in the galaxy, and because its spores can survive in space for thousands of years, there is little hope that its original homeworld will ever be identified, and numerous cultures have mythological stories revolving around these creatures, the most notable being the Tusken Raiders, who swore that the Sarlacc was a self-created god that gave birth to itself in the core of Tatooine, long before their sun split in two. The end of the world would come about when the Sarlacc devoured all of Tatooine, and the beast would be forced to devour itself, presumably marking the end of all existence. When these spores, called Sarlacci, came into contact with any source of plant or animal life, it would start to devour it like a leech or tick, eventually growing in size to reach its larval stage. Now it could travel around its environment to hunt new prey, with its tentacle-like appendages pulling things into its layers of teeth and mouths. Growing larger, they reached this adolescent period about half the size of a human, and they would furiously hunt down their prey with blistering speed, and now fully formed tongue and mouth that would operate much like its final form. But in this proactive hunting phase, they would swarm on anything that came in their path. Between the spore and adolescent phase, nearly all of them would die, as all cultures and even animals knew that when they met a Sarlacc pack, they had to attempt to eradicate it immediately. You could imagine that even at times of war, there must have been things like ceasefires to deal with the greater threat of roaming Sarlaccs, civilizations taking a break before they got back to fighting each other. but the ones that did survive enter into a sort of teenager, young adult phase, and one of the first signs of a deeper intelligence is that it would start to challenge much larger prey in hopes of being swallowed whole. This was a much easier way to capture calories, as they would devour the host from the inside out, until the creature died, and then that corpse was still dined on for weeks, until not even the bones remained. Again, this whole phase lasted thousands of years, and after countless banthas, dewbacks, rancors, or whatever else it came across, roughly 30,000 years of being an organic black hole, it would finally settle down and enter its mature plant-like phase. Like a massive oak, fungus, and Venus flytrap all in one, it would use its beak-like tongue to burrow 100 meters under the surface. Remember, it really could be in almost any environment if we see one thriving on Tatooine. And on jungle worlds, you could imagine they had much more calories, and would grow even larger or at least support many more sarlaccs. The tentacles would grow out in each direction to act like roots, as they could absorb nutrients through the skin. This meant that even if large prey didn't approach the mouth, anything that died within this enormous circle of nutrient collection could still feed the sarlacc. This thing lives on scales of thousands of years, so all the little bugs, rodents, microbes, and big game that died and dissolved would provide that little bit of sustenance as it worked its way into the sands or soil. These terrors are so large that most cultures knew to avoid entire areas around a buried sarlacc, and all the animals also knew these areas were off limits. So the sarlacc victims were usually the young of these animals that got separated from the pack, or visitors from other worlds that did not know the area. The tendrils around the mouth would emit pheromones and odors that lured in many types of species, being able to mimic thousands of plants and animal smells, so that the ignorant or desperate come close enough to be snatched up. If it tried to escape, it would be impaled by the thousands of razor-sharp, meter-long teeth, as this fleshy mouth would undulate to ensure the target was pierced and killed. Then the tendrils could use the teeth to rip larger prey like banthas up into smaller chunks, but because this creature lived so long and prey tried so hard to avoid it, could go extremely long between meals. In part due to those roots picking up nutrients, but also because when it did swallow its prey whole, it purposely kept it alive in its stomach to be digested on for eons.
In his belly you will find a new definition of pain and suffering, as you are slowly digested over 1,000 years.
Once you make it past the hardened beak-like exterior of the main tongue, you pass through a 3-meter wide mouth, and beyond that a sand trap that would keep soils from passing into the stomachs. Right before the digestion begins, you pass through a jungle of stinging tentacles that inject a neurotoxin that paralyzes the victim and makes for easier transport to the proper stomach. Boba likely recovered from the neurotoxin because of his suit and his experience from a life as a bounty hunter, as he once survived falling into a patch of poisonous Zabar fungus in his youth, faking his death when attacked by General Grievous, who was certain that Boba must be dead if he was caught up in these toxins. So some combination of his resolve, genetics, and technology in the suit helps him to regain control of his body in the sarlacc. Just past these toxic tendrils, we see the first sign of one of the strangest aspects of this creature, making it one of the most interesting in the galaxy. Sarlacc biology may hold the key to understanding the connection between our physical bodies and metaphysical aspects like consciousness, as it is somehow able to keep personal identities alive and thinking, even though the original host body was dissolved into the sarlacc flesh. In fact, it can detect the intelligence of the victim as it passes this area. If it's a mindless animal, it will be dropped down into the main stomach, still devoured over centuries and lined with countless meat cubbies to maintain the slowly dissolving prey. But these two side stomachs were used for intelligent prey, those with something we might call a soul. Coruscant biologists haven't the slightest clue how this works, but many spiritual groups like the Jedi suspect that it must be some sort of Force sensitivity. If the Force enables one to retain their consciousness after death, it must be related to consciousness itself. And since we know of some creatures like the Ysalmiri, Voxen, and Lothwolf use their Force connection for various purposes, it is reasonable to conclude that this ancient creature could also be in tune somehow. But stranger yet is that once the body is dissolved, the consciousness is trapped in the flesh of the sarlacc, joining a sort of hive mind or server with digital avatars trapped in a dreamlike state, with glimpses of their past life breaking through to their awareness of this bloody red flesh walls of hell. Boba's survival made him an unexpected hero to xenobiologists everywhere, as legends have it that when a scientist got hold of a holo recorder from Boba's helmet, he discovered a new disturbing aspect to the sarlacc. By using its connection to the consciousness of its victims, it would also use a sort of telepathic torture, causing nightmare-like visions as Boba was reacting to and fighting things that were not actually on the recording. If he had stayed too long, he too would have been swallowed up into the consciousness, and specifically this one on Tatooine had swallowed several Jedi over its 30,000 plus year lifespan. For some reference, that's older than the Old Republic and Sith Empire, older even than the Prime Jedi and Jedi Order, and over this nearly entire recorded galactic history, it swallowed at least 2 Jedi, one by the name of Suzeho and the other one lost to time. Suzeho was digested for several thousand years, and his consciousness was in this constant torture and communion with his captor. While his final body faded into the cells of the Sarlacc, so too did his mind. His mind was embodied in this very hell that swallowed him, and he would communicate with the victims over millennia, learning of galactic affairs from the other Jedi and travelers like wayward settlers and hunters. Legends say Boba would have lengthy conversations with this voice in his head, which at this point swore to Fett that it was the Sarlacc itself. Eventually, Boba got it to understand that Suzeho was losing his memories of his real life before the Sarlacc, and kept pushing and insulting him in order to trick the being into using its tentacles to crush Boba's jetpack, causing an explosion that allowed him to escape in Legends. Biologists believe that this absorption of minds from various different sentient beings allowed it to create a hive intelligence that helped the Sarlacc to attract more prey. But with Boba's helmet recordings, other scientists posited a darker conclusion, that this was just to appeal to a sadistic side of the semi-sentient creature, that in this unfathomably long and boring life as an eating pit, the Sarlacc was intelligent enough to want to play with its food, much like some monkeys or dolphins, and mentally and physically torturing its victims seemed to be the highest level of interaction that it could come up with. Or at least this one on Tatooine. Perhaps other Sarlacc's used their intelligences differently. And this is just kind of crazy speculation of my own, but if it does have these weird sort of telepathic powers, who knows what role it could have played when Jabba was carrying out his execution. As we know, many Force wielders do not believe in coincidences, and Han getting that lucky hit on Boba was a hell of a coinkydink. Crazy for sure, but something fun to think about. There were a few other people that did escape this fate, like Zorba the Hutt, who claimed the monster threw him up because even Sarlacc knew they couldn't digest a hardy Hutt. Though no one believed this, but they also couldn't provide an alternative. One 15-year-old daughter of moisture farmers was running from stormtroopers when she stumbled into the pit, only to have the stormtroopers devoured, while she was thrown back out to the sand. And then there was Starkiller's battle with Shaak Ti on Felucia. She was with the Felucian locals, who had a religious reverence for the Sarlacc, calling it the Ancient Abyss, and using it for ritual sacrifices since time immemorial. The battle would take them into the mouth, where the Jedi would be able to use the Force to take control of the tentacles, which almost swallowed up Vader's apprentice, but his resolve and powers in the dark side forced Shaak Ti to give up the fight and fall into the mouth, where she appears to have become one with the Force. And speaking of these Jedi, the oldest lightsaber form, Form 1, which was the first one taught to all members of the Jedi Order, was called Shi-Cho, or the Way of the Sarlacc. This must mean that the Jedi Order was well aware of the Sarlacc even in its earliest times, though it is an odd creature to name your saber combat after. This tradition was so old that the Jedi themselves lost records on who named it this or why, and the closest explanation may have something to do with this being taught alongside philosophies of incapacitating your opponent without killing them. In a way, the Sarlacc too just disables you and technically doesn't kill you, at least not for a while. A few more things to look at in this cross-section is the multiple hearts that are paired with multiple lungs, which keep blood flowing throughout the miles of veins and arteries, which actually grew like roots into the victims, and also moved digestive enzymes, meaning the prey was being digested from the outside in and inside out, presumed to have created a constant boiling and burning sensation. Some of these would grow out to act more like roots, collecting moisture from the soil, and even the great tendrils towards the base are called the anchored root system, pointing at the debate on whether this should be considered an animal or plant or something unique in between. And all of the main body was covered in a thick layer of plate-like armor coating. In its environment, many would develop a symbiotic relationship with the birds or small creatures like the Urusai, which clean its teeth and tentacles. Some animals like the Anuba would use the Sarlacc as a hunting aid, herding their prey towards the pit, where the prey would choose to risk charging into the Anuba pack instead of trying its luck with certain and worse death than the Sarlacc. Its only known predator was to be a fully grown crate dragon, as nothing else really is this large and mobile. Jabba was advised to destroy the Sarlacc in the Great Pit of Carkoon several times, but it was one of his most prized collections, definitely his most fear-inducing pet. Rancor shows are great and could be done on short notice, but you could make a real memorable party out of a Sarlacc execution. And then there were some scientists that kept alive dream uses of this creature. There was the hope that you could study ancient versions of species that were still being kept alive in their stomachs. But the Holy Grail was to find how the preservation enzymes in the stomach kept flesh alive for thousands of years. It's ironic to think that Boba would have to maintain intense Bacta treatments for the wounds inflicted by the Sarlacc, but in the future, the next miracle healing fluid that might finally replace the blue juice may come from this horrific creature, rescuing the Holy Grail of immortality from the depths of hell itself. They also determined that it shared a common ancestor with the Rathar, Blixus, and Vixus, all ancient and able to thrive in space, as well as nearly any world they found themselves on. So that's it for the breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. There was a mini Sarlacc bred through unknown means that was sold on Coruscant during the Clone Wars, with one named Phileas being sold by a droid in the Jedi Temple. Though it is funny to wonder if it wasn't a mini Sarlacc at all, and was kinda like when somebody lies about the breed of the puppy, and the owner gets shocked to see how big it is. Since the infant stage of the Sarlacc is so long, maybe it could stay this cute little size for your entire lifetime. On Tatooine, there were at least 4 massive Sarlaccs, and the author of the story with the Jedi Suzeo says that the name is "Oh Jesus" backwards. Not sure of the symbolism there, but the character was created because he wanted to make the Sarlacc intelligent, but Lucasfilm vetoed that, and so the alternative was to make him semi-sentient who absorbs intelligences. The sounds of the Sarlacc were created from alligator hissing sounds, mixed with the sounds from the stomachs of the Return of the Jedi crew after they ate a bunch of pizza. Yes, that's true. The beak and extra tentacles were added in the re-release because Lucas said the original never seemed alive to him. The male attaching to the female to mate was based on the anglerfish, and nothing says this explicitly, but many believe that it was based on the sandworm from Dune, and we find the Sarlacc is in the Dune Sea, and Lucas acknowledges inspiration from the novel, which also had large desert vehicles called sandcrawlers, and the drug Spice. Sarlacc has appeared in a ton of games like Super Star Wars and Force Unleashed, and expanded upon in books like The Essential Guide to Alien Species, Atlas, and Ultimate Star Wars. And there's a bit of lore that is confusing, but too potentially cool to not mention. It's said that in rare cases where the Sarlacc's stomach was too filled with food, it wouldn't throw up the excess. Instead, it seems to be saying that it would be able to integrate the beings and direct food into them, augmenting its own stomach with the numerous smaller stomachs of its prey. And Han and Chewie were once on a mission to go into a Sarlacc's stomach to collect a chemical that could be used to make an explosive. So that's it for the Sarlacc. If you like this video, the best way to help me out is to just hit that like button, leave a comment down below, or share this video. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more. But most important of all, remember, no matter how long you've been stuck there, never mistake yourself for the hell you find yourself in. And the Force will be with you, always.
Oh my!
Their tortured squeals will send a piercing message to all potential challengers to your throne.
What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is going to be a complete history of 8D8, and we'll look at its droid series as a whole. One of the strangest manufacturers in the galaxy who produced an AI that blew past the debates of sentience and straight into sadism. 8D8 is the most famous unit of a very popular line of the 8D series smelter droids, produced by the Roche Hive. It was a company run by the Verpine species, out of the Roche asteroid field in Sector Q8 in the Mid-Rim. The Verpine were an insectoid, relatively peaceful, and highly technological society that, despite joining the Republic in its earliest years, sometime between 25,000 and 22,000 BBY, these bugs never really fit in with the galactic community, and remained an isolated hive to the point that many would never lay eyes on one, but almost everyone came in contact with Verpine products, either through the droid business with the full name of the Roche Hive Mechanical Apparatus Design and Construction Activity for those who need the Hive's machine. A name that gives a nice look at how these odd beings' minds work, and foreshadows some of the quirks of 8D8. And then there was the company Slain and Corporal that produced popular starships like the B-19 Torrent, T-6 Shuttle, Praxis Speeder, MG-100 Star Fortress, and further developed and mass-produced the Mon Cala prototyped B-Wing. Now their droid line included this Psych, IX-6, J9, and this 8D smelter. The J9 was their first well-known product, but not for good reasons, as it became a joke, something of a meme across the galaxy as everyone loved to make fun of this crash and burn failure of a protocol droid, as the Verpine did not appreciate how much other species would be unnerved by the bug-like appearance, the buzzing vocoder speech pattern, and their own programmers' poor understanding of Galactic Basic, as even the name confused consumers, not being a worker droid intended for labor, but was supposed to be a protocol droid like the 3PO series. Even worse is it developed its own odd and insulting terms, as the main buyer of protocol droids was nobility or wealthy merchants, and this droid kept referring to them as royal jelly. People were both confused and offended, and Verpine engineers were just as confused and distraught at this emergent behavior. The 8D series would develop a unique emergent behavior of its own, hitting peak sadism with 8D8 specifically, but keep in mind that most droid units do have quirks and this emergent phenomena, leading to those that argue that droids should be given full legal rights and considered sentient beings. Something fought for by both organics and units like L3.
Congratulations, you're liberated. Scoot. I don't know. Free your brothers and sisters or something. Just give me some space.
Or groups like the Droid Gotra that have fought to carve out an inorganic society after the Clone Wars, often committing acts of terrorism to do this. While legends say that IG-88 led a revolution to take the world Mechas 3 in order to build a droid army. Droids of all types have personalities that often develop out of their role and interaction with organics. And with many of them, it seems that their job of scrapping other droids and melting them down, without any affection or interaction with organics, this AI turns sadistic. Engineers speculate that this is because of a common trick in AI development. Since you have to deal with things like these emergent personalities, they try to tie joy or pleasure to the task that you want them to complete. So while most of these smelting units may just be operating the machines that turn raw ore into metal, many of them were also the droids used to break down other scrapped droids, separating them into their component parts, and then melting that back into metal slabs that could be sold in order to make new droids. It's a bit disturbing, but imagine if some superior alien race dumped unwanted human slaves into a big pit, and you were charged with separating bone, muscle, organs, and hair, those component parts, and then melting those into giant pools of ground bone and meat, and the off-unique parts like eyes that might be repurposed by the aliens in their labs to create new and better human slaves to serve their new needs. If you did that for long enough, and those aliens made your mind work so that carrying out this job was the one thing that brought you pleasure, it's easy to see how you would develop into something that looked like sadism from the outside. These 8D droids associating other droids' scream of pain with their own self-actualization, the joy of serving out the purpose that they were made for. And the droid torture victim is screaming for the exact same reasons, having a reaction like fear and pain when it knew it was about to be terminated and prevented from serving out its function. And because it was designed to work in some of the most dangerous environments in the galaxy, being exposed to constant temperatures around 1,650 degrees centigrade, or 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hot enough to melt steel, the skin on this droid was to be made of a proprietary heat-resistant alloy called Duravlex, as well as having reinforced fireproof joints, giving it a melting point said to be over 4,000 degrees centigrade. The eyes or photoreceptors would see into the ultraviolet range, but focused on heat detection to ensure successful smelting. The brain or logic processor was located in the chest, while the power supply was up in the head, with a recharging port in the back. The skeleton was simple but incredibly powerful so that it could move around large and heavy machines. The head design was another Verpine PR disaster, as it was designed to resemble the Mune species, which they hoped to be flattering for the Munes, who owned much of the galaxy's major manufacturing facilities. But rumors were spreading about this droid being evil, and also looked like one of the most hated species in the galaxy. The ones that use debt to crush people, manipulate economies, and fund both sides of wars. The galaxy was a very confusing place for these bug engineers, not very appreciative of this lowly worker droid made to look like them. It could have been another Verpine disaster, but luckily these units were very cheap, and over time many criminal elements liked to use these droids to carry out interrogations, leveraging their bad reputation for intimidation purposes, and secure in knowing that there was no chance at any sympathies developing or some sort of small droid rebellion being led by this unit. Cad Bane would use one to carry out the torture and extraction of info from C-3PO, hoping that Senator Amidala's personal droid would contain the blueprints for the Senate building.
According to the analyzer, he is not lying.
As this bad reputation compounded, this became the go-to model for those in need of droid information extraction. A process that is not as simple as it sounds, as there are built-in responses to protect sensitive information, like we see with Cad Bane when he was using his software to search through C-3PO's hardware. But it's not just that it would have been quicker if he complied. Of course, in this case, 3PO couldn't because he didn't have the info. But even if he did, many droids' programming have fail-safes against this kind of intrusion. In a world where droids are ubiquitous, The threat of people extracting sensitive info has been around as long as the Republic, nearly 30,000 years at this point. So AI engineers have long addressed this risk, and so any intruder ran the chance of activating some self-destruct failsafe, sometimes literally an explosion, or more often just a deletion of this sensitive info if the AI detected intrusion. It's odd to think about, but this is why it actually makes sense to torture a droid for info instead of just hacking in. This isn't exactly how the brain works, but work with me on this analogy. Imagine if we had some technology where I could carve out chunks of your brain to see what memory was stored there. I run the risk of permanently damaging it and losing it forever. Ideally, I would want to just be able to make you tell me. Unless, of course, the torture kills you, which is where interrogation droids come in. The EV series of droids are designated as supervisor droids, but as the Force would have it, this series was like the D8 in that it was one of the company's biggest accidents. Marin Data also made interrogator droids, which were specifically created to understand vast amounts of info on all known species, and deliver both physical and chemical torture methods, as well as monitor these effects in real time to ensure the victim was brought as close to death as possible without crossing over. For the EV series, a manufacturing issue installed a torture droid motivator along with the supervising protocols. These were sold to market, and customers saw a boom in productivity, as the supervisors would push other droids in ways never seen before. Marin Data only realized the inclusion of torture droid programming after all the critical acclaim when they went to improve the line. Turns out a manager that operated like a torturer worked excellently. Supervising and taking a victim to the edge of breaking had a lot more in common than the programmers expected. So if you had the credits, and need, those like Hutt crime bosses, the pairing of an EV and 8D would make for the ultimate droid information extraction team. By pitting the victim's self-preservation protocols at odds with their commands to conceal info, EV-99 and 8D8 would amplify each other's sadism as the years went by. Everyone on Tatooine, from farmers to smugglers, bounty hunters to mayors, all made use of some sort of personal droid. And this team in Jabba's dungeon were responsible for getting intel out that would be used to create bounty hunting contracts that would then be spread to the visitors above in Jabba's palace. Over the years, 8D8 came in contact with all sorts of units, and smarter droids like Astromechs and protocol droids that could tell he was of a much simpler design. So in their final moments, some would insult the dumb smelter. But also, the 8D knew it was more intelligent than most of your repair and power droids, further adding to its AI complexes, getting pleasure out of torturing the elitist droids, and seeing itself superior to the lower class droids, as things like gonks admittedly did not have much intel to spill. Instead, there was a degree of joy that came from the act of torture itself, as it was now tied to serving its purpose. But this resentment towards the higher class droids also applied to his supposedly higher intelligence EV superior, whom 8D was said to have a secret hatred for, plotting to rise up in the palace when he got a chance. And it's unclear exactly how this went down, but this unit designed to resist blast furnaces would have won any direct fight they got into. But whatever happened, it resulted in EV-99 being sent out of the palace to be a supervisor of personnel in Shalman's spaceport cantina, with Bib Fortuna surviving the short civil war and 8D8 rising to a sort of new major domo. It would be 5 years before Boba killed Bib and took over, and we see that in this time he attained an encyclopedia level of knowledge on the workings of Tatooine, either done just through the torture of droids, and or by using its intelligence to understand that if its job was to provide information, gathering it could extend to other means than just torture alone, or just torturing droids. Because in this major domo role, he was required to have knowledge of the complex political powers, names, and backgrounds of all the players from all over Tatooine and beyond, evolving into a need to be the one presenting the visitors, accepting gifts, and even going further to provide advice.
Their tortured squeals will send a piercing message to all potential challengers to your throne. Respectfully, Lord Fett, on Tatooine, you must project strength if you are to be accepted as a daimyo.
Though with the Nightwind Assassin, we see how he can be stuck in tradition, or perhaps be taking things like rumors and reputations a bit too literal.
Their reputation is legendary. There is no way this one will talk.
They're just people in hoods.
There is no way he will talk. They fear no man.
And like how he could not refrain from providing intel to Fett, even when Fett said he was too busy for it, 8D8 just couldn't hold it in and keeps going on.
You like this? Huh?
Excuse me, Lord Fett.
Not now, I'm busy.
We heard back from the mayor's office. He remains completely unavailable for at least the next 20 days.
Along with other quirks that came with working with organic emotion, which gives us a window into either his own personality or Bib Fortuna's.
We're under the protection of the name that should not be spoken.
You can say, Jabba.
I was concerned that you would feel insulted.
Why would I feel insulted?
Because you felt threatened.
Well, now I am insulted.
Apologies, Master Fett.
And we see that he both directs guests on how to speak to the Master, but also gets personally offended when the Master is insulted.
No one respects you.
Enough!
Showing how the directive of AIs to serve their masters, combined with being such a complex AI, does make for such unique personalities, whether it was just supposed to translate, fix ships, or smelt. So that's it for the breakdown of 88, the droid that went from the lava hot furnaces, to the torture expert of a crime boss, to Major Domo of the galaxy's most feared bounty hunter and new daimyo. If you made it this far, the best way to help me out is to hit that like button, leave a comment, and share this video somewhere. But most important of all, remember, at the end of the day, it's all emergent phenomena, and the Force will be with you. Always.
5 Hutt families on the distant world of Nal Hutta.
This territory is mine. Go back to Nal Hutta.
What's up, meta nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown and history of the capital of the Hutt crime empire, Nal Hutta, a world that was originally known as Evokar, and is not the homeworld of the Hutt species. I'll get to that in a bit, but let's start by looking at this planet's location at grid coordinates S12 on the galactic map. Right at the intersection of major hyperspace highways that brought wealth into and sent vices out of the heart of Hutt space, all within the outer rim of the galaxy. At a diameter of 12,150 kilometers, it was about the same size as Coruscant, and had a Type 1 oxygen mix, a breathable atmosphere for a majority of species, along with standard gravity and a 315-day year, and an 87-hour-long day, within a star system that contained a single sun and 6 planets totaling 27 moons. This is called the Tube system, and roughly around the year 15,000 BBY, the Hutt invasion of Evokar began following the environmental destruction of their homeworld, Varl. There were some small Hutt colonies on the surface for hundreds of years before this, but it was still mostly controlled by the native Evoki. Once the Hutt homeworld was inhospitable, the major families decided to launch an all-out war, a war of legal technicalities, with armies of lawyers that drew up contracts and exchanged native lands for alien high-tech devices. Any Republic advisors brought in couldn't dispute these legal purchases, and as you could predict, they kept buying more and more land until the natives were pushed into a tiny area. As the Evoki could tell where this was going, some of them fled to the moon of Nar Shaddaa. Hindsight is 2020, and it's only obvious now that if they wanted to flee the debauchery and crime-ridden society of the Hutts, Nar Shaddaa was even worse than Nal Hutta, as the planet's moon was even more pleasant to a variety of species, becoming a sort of evil brother to Coruscant, with endless neon-covered buildings housing everything from gambling to slave and spice markets. A world where there was no concept of the term legal or illegal. In that, these worlds were similar, but Nal Hutta was for the Hutts from then on out. The once massive trees that made up the planet-spanning rainforests were flattened, and without them the swamps increased in size to almost completely cover this world. Some of this work to destroy Evokar was actually done by the remaining Evoki, who were captured as slaves and made to operate the machines that would tear down the last remnants of their civilization, as none of their architecture remains even as far back as 3500 BBY. These little genocides were just what came with running a galaxy-spanning crime empire, and they were incensed when an Evoki named Huttsbane started launching terrorist attacks on the refined Hutt cultural centers. As Suda Nemro lamented, the Evoki sold us this world for trinkets. Now they take up arms against their rightful masters. It's disgusting. With the incredibly thick atmosphere keeping everything constantly moist with showers and layers of fog, and now a global swamp headquarters right next to the rapidly expanding Sin capital of Nar Shaddaa, the Hutts finally had a world they could call home, at least until this one ran into a complete environmental collapse as well. And they would call it the Glorious Jewel, and as Borga the Hutt would put it, quote, "In fact, we Hutts know a good deal about remaking worlds. When we arrived here from Varl, for example, Glorious Jewel was not the paradise you see now, but a primitive world of dense forests and untamed seas. Though to outsiders, this world was still a bit dreary and horrifying, with dragon snakes that would lay in wait under the thick, muddy waters, using their dozens of movement detection organs to pounce on any unsuspecting prey that it came across. often nesting in gnarled tree roots, which are also home to the Shirelian Toops, small starfish-like creatures that developed a symbiotic relationship with the Hutts, being able to clean up bacteria and food stuck under the flaps of skin. And over time, these became a fashion accessory, being worn by both Marlowe and Mama Hutt as headpieces.
You gon' sit in your stank, and you gon' pass the slime pods.
Slime pods were little organisms that were scooped up to make one of their favorite dishes, and would have blue glowing algae growing alongside it. While the skies were filled with these floating creatures and a pterodactyl-like bird, which did not appear to be registered on any galactic databases. And as their industry grew, chemical waste proved to be delicious to the then named Chemilizard that could reach up to 20 meters long. With this planet as their HQ, the Hutt families would continue to grow the economy of Nar Shaddaa, to the point that this area of space was considered an equal or even larger economy than Coruscant for the following 11,000 years. Some dark HoloNet conspiracy theorists think that it's suspicious that just as the Sith Empire was rising, the Utmian-Pabul hyperspace route collapsed when a nearby star went supernova, having the effect of drastically cutting off the trade to this Hutt-controlled area, rapidly accelerating the economy of the Republic capital of Coruscant at just the right time. This pushed the Hutts even deeper into the vice trade, and so these planets focused on what they were good at, Hutt space dominating the gray and black market goods, knowing that even if Coruscant got the big legit businesses, their leaders and politicians loved the vices bought in Hutt space, and their economy still depended on the key elements like bounty hunters, slavers, and data slicers that were all still well under the control of the Hutt families. The 5 Hutt families was the informal term for the Council of Elders, the governing body of all Hutt space since the fall of their homeworld Varl, and since the taking of Nal Hutta in 15,000 BBY, they would stay in power from then on out, making this government one of the longest existing in the entire galaxy. The Elders could only come from the clans of the Ancients, which were the powerful families since their time on Varl, the clans Vosadi, Vandarajar, Jarama, Kajadir, Gorensla, Barish, Konalak, Basadi, and Dasilijic. And these families proved strong enough to retain this area of space, even as the Sith Empire would send countless spies to sow division on Nal Hutta and Nar Shaddaa, hoping to prop up local gangs and rival Hutt families.
We believe Nemro has been reluctant to lose Republic customers by publicly siding with the Empire. It's time he overcame this reluctance. We need to know what Nemro and his advisors are thinking before we can act. I want you to obtain access to the Nemro clan's inner circle.
One of the most famous from the Clone Wars era would be Gardula Basadi the Elder, the once ruler of Tatooine before Jabba of the Dasilijic clan was able to wrestle control from her. By 21 BBY, she would call an assembly of the Hutt ruling families to meet at her palace on Nal Hutta, in order to discuss the fate of Zero the Hutt, who stole invaluable and incriminating Hutt council records to protect himself. Of course, the Coruscanti politicians and major corporations would not be surprised at the connections to industries and extravagances coming from Hutt space, but the public would go through a short-term outrage that would be bad for business, and might even lead to some theatrical justice being dealt out, a use of force that might result in the killing off of some Hutt or lower-level crime lord. For causing all this trouble, Zero would be detained in the massive dungeon of the Basadi Palace, and keep in mind that all the families had palaces like these all over Nal Hutta, and even some from up-and-coming families that were not one of the clans of the Ancients. These palaces were made from the thick gnarl woods and shaped mud that made for the perfect climate for the Hutts. And the more common buildings were of course smaller, but almost all structures on this planet are built using the same method. From Zero's mama's hut to rows of housing and shops, all built using this natural method. A funny irony from a species known for causing environmental destruction, but luckily once they got Nal Hutta from rainforest to swamp, at least this swamp was ideal for them, and now they almost live harmoniously with nature. To travel across this world, they would use an airboat-like hovercraft, or for long distance just go by starship. Their largest city was Bibosa, the capital, which contained the largest spaceport on Nal Hutta, and was always seeing a constant stream of shady visitors of every species. The bazaar would lead to eateries, cantinas, and pawn shops like Pablo's, which had just about every piece of armor and weaponry you could hope for.
Pablo's pawn shop has everything a bounty hunter needs, and more.
Even having pieces of clone trooper armor for sale. Given how large-scale the Clone Wars were, it is very reasonable to assume that anything that touched the battlefront, from DC-15 blasters to droidicas, all could be purchased in Hutt space for the right amount of credits. In this hub, we can see that everything is under strict Hutt control, using mostly Nikto and Gamorrean guards on constant patrol, because even the underworld should be orderly. but this didn't mean they could protect you from being swindled in clever ways.
So you only gave him enough fuel to reach the nearest filling station on Arandia, which is owned by your brother. Well, that's a nice little money-making scam.
Now this world, the crime lord's Coruscant and seat of Hutt power, would go unchallenged for most of its history, affording the Hutts the chance to align themselves with either the Republic or Separatists or just stay neutral. Only tipping over to allow the Republic to use their space when Dooku was revealed to be the one behind the kidnapping of Jabba's son, Rhoda. The only one to ever force them into anything was Darth Maul, when he formed the Shadow Collective, using Death Watch Mandalorian forces to snowball his takeover of smaller crime syndicates like Black Sun, triggering the Pike Syndicate to voluntarily join to avoid conflict. And he was now brazen enough to take these forces directly to the Council in meeting on Nal Hutta. Imagine their disbelief as these long-lived leaders, the unopposed heads of clans that had ruled for 15,000 years, sitting in a palace on a homeworld they created, and hear the small humanoid say,
"Your lives, in exchange for Hutt space and everything in its borders."
This was not taken well, and as you would imagine, it's one of the most protected places in the galaxy, as hordes of bounty hunters and palace guards would spring up from behind the Hutt seats, and from every nook and cranny of the building. Intense fighting that pushed the invaders out, only for the Mando reinforcements to help push back and take the council room. Protocols were in place for this unlikely event, and all the Hutts were able to quickly flee to their ships, and were well off world by now, all except Aruba.
So the only thing that you can tell me is that I will find Jabba at Jabba's palace.
After he was killed, the Shadow Collective immediately rushed to Tatooine, and with Mandalorian starfighters and ground troops, they quickly overtook Jabba's palace, storming into the throne room to find Jabba and Gorga, who revealed that the Hutt elders had come to a new decision.
The mighty Jabba and the Hutt families have decided to join you.
Even into the Imperial and following New Republic era, the Hutts would retain control of Hutt space, these long-lived slugs knowing how to keep politicians in check by the use of credits, vice, and blackmail, and like with Darth Maul, cooperating just enough to retain their own power, or to allow those in power on Coruscant to save face. Though legends say they finally met their match in the year 26 ABY, where they tried to backstab the extra-galactic Yuuzhan Vong, who promptly retaliated with an orbital bombardment. The Vong would reduce both Nal Hutta and Nar Shaddaa to a rich soil bed, literally using the organic tech, mostly advanced bacteria, to pump into the atmosphere of these worlds and break down both machines and people into a nutrient-rich dirt. In the relative blink of an eye, these masters of terraforming to create their unique living industries and technologies, called Vong forming, would prove to be the second time Nal Hutta was drastically changed to suit its new lords. What remained of the Hutt cartels were scattered across the stars, and forced to set up a new, sad and broken version of the ruling council on Tatooine, a world that couldn't be farther from their beloved, hazy, moist, and slimy swamp. And over the following decades after the Vong were defeated, some Hutts would try to make it back to their glorious jewel, though it would never again be the seat of Hutt power, or nearly as beautiful in their eyes as it was in the days of old. So that's it for its history and breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. The depiction of Gardulla's palace was something George Lucas had in his mind for decades, imagining the Hutts living in bulbous structures that rose up out of the foggy swamp. And it was only for the Clone Wars that the world received a large ring, but it also became more green, perhaps showing nature recovering from the Hutt's original deforestation and becoming a healthy, proper swampland, while also generating more space debris from waste and destroyed ships accumulating over thousands of years. The Khajiitic banners, or logos of the crime syndicate run by each family, were originally in the concept art right in front of their corresponding Hutt, but in the episode we see that the banners are between them, and that they do not always sit in the same seats. An interesting sort of humbleness among these cutthroat gangsters, perhaps showing a lessening of the individual and clan, and deference to the council as an entity, where they were all equal, sitting by banners that were not your own, but of your fellow clan elders. A nice touch in theory, even if the Hutts often plotted against and killed each other. And it's unclear why Zero's father's tomb would be on Teth, not Nal Hutta. Perhaps it has something to do with the dry environment, or that Teth was considered a more spiritual place to be buried, as it was a major Hutt cultural world, once ruled by the Ba'omar monks, who also built Jabba's palace on Tatooine. If you made it this far, please hit that like button and subscribe, but most important of all, remember, one man's toxic swamp is another Hutt's glorious jewel, and the Force will be with you, always.
try spinning. That's a good trick.
What's up, meta nerds? This video will be an updated, complete breakdown in history of the N1 Starfighter, looking under the armor and out to the different variants and uses over 60 plus years, from before the Clone Wars out to the Battle of Exegol. Let's start with its manufacturer, Theed Palace Space Vessel Engineering Corps, which was the in-house or in-palace shipwrights that made their own exclusive ships for the royal family and military.
I mean, these are all handmade, no droids!
That being said, they did not produce all of their parts, especially not the major components like engines and weapons. Instead, it was something like building your own PC, getting the top-of-the-line materials and assembling them on Naboo. Most of these components come from Nubia Star Drives, a company considered to be the highest level luxury brand in the galaxy, both in terms of their mechanical standards, but also praised for their unique and beautiful designs. Everyone across the galaxy knew their reputation.
Oh, not bad, Nubian, huh?
The Royal House would make use of the J-type craft like the 327 and Cruiser, which instantly impressed people with a complete chromium plating, a material that had greater blast resistance than your standard Durasteel, and it was easier to clean as well as being better at blocking out electrical interference, perfect for defensive countermeasures. And of course, it let people know that you were incredibly wealthy. And on Naboo, all other ships were banned from using this material, as it became synonymous with the royal ships. It's interesting to note that though C-3PO looks goldish, he and many other droids would have a light chromium finishing layer, likely for the block against electrical interference and resistance to carbon buildup, while Captain Phasma chose it for a combo of all of the traits mentioned, with her chromium being salvaged from a lost wreckage of a J-type ship that was personally owned by Emperor Palpatine. The N1 would measure 11 meters or 36 feet long, or about a Wookiee shorter than an X-Wing, and about 2 meters longer than the droid's LAAT. And everything we're about to see, including the chromium plating, totals up to a cost of 200,000 credits. As we go under the plating, start by noting that the fuel tank and sensor arrays were some of the few parts that were crafted entirely by the Theed engineers. It's unclear what type of fuel they used, and as advanced as it is, there's a possibility that it used hypermatter like a Utapawan P-39 Starfighter, but I find that really unlikely, especially with what we see later. More likely it was Tabana gas, which is able to be used in your energy weapons and ion weapons, and is in a majority of ships from fighter to destroyer, or it could have been Malastair fuel or rhodium. Again, likely Tabana, like that produced on Cloud City, and it would get pumped in via the tail that gets docked into a coupling unit that lined the palace hangars. And the electrical systems and data cables were also connected here as well. These units lining each dock likely represent fuel and energy levels, and the electricity goes through the power charge collector, and ship info and updates go through the electromag signal receiver, charging the power node, and then the power cells which energize the bolts for the twin laser cannons, as well as the mechanism that fires the proton torpedoes, which had 2 magazines which each carried 5 torpedoes, or 10 in total that would fire through this single tube. The fuel pumps and hydraulics are also packed into the central area, with multiple fuel lines going out to the nacelles, energized in the ionization chamber. Most Star Wars ships use ion propulsion, a real technology but which is nowhere near as effective yet, and like the twin ion engine fighter of the Empire, almost all ships move forward by energizing a gas and shooting the resulting ions out of the back. This is what causes the blue glow, and the combustion chamber on the N1 is one of those highly customized pieces by the Theed engineers, made to withstand higher temperatures, and they combined it with the ship's iconic finials. Besides the graceful and elegant appearance, they were a stunning piece of engineering that worked to draw the heat off in a way that was said to be more efficient than any other ship, out of a combo of rapidly circulating coolant and just the shape. The need for this was also in part out of an environmental concern, as Naboo had been trying to reduce emissions on their world for centuries, seeing what many other worlds in the Mid and Outer Rim did to devastate their atmospheres, either through war or industry. And that is why the Naboo people are noted for having both this ancient-looking architecture and being environmentalists and pacifists, seeing the negative effects of the warmongering and high industrialization of their neighbors. This efficient engine was a J-type Nubian 221, while the hyperdrive was a Nubian Monarch C4. The sublight engines hit a top atmospheric speed of 1,100 km per hour, or 684 miles per hour, making it faster than the X-Wing but slower than a TIE. though I'll talk about how it was modified later to be perhaps the fastest ship in the galaxy, but even this model had an impressive Class 1 hyperdrive with a 1,000 light-year range. Larger fighters like X-Wings and ARC-170s have hyperdrives built in, but many smaller craft like droid fighters or Jedi starships did not have them, and like we saw with the Jedi, they had to use these hyperspace rings instead. The N1 was only limited by the size of its fuel tank, and a way to extend this was to have the diplomatic barge acting like a refueling dock, where the tails could attach just like on Naboo. These engines also have an array of sensors to detect any issues, and towards the front of the nacelle we see the pressure manifold and cluster of rangefinder, targeting systems, and flight sensors, while the comm antennas and receivers line the front ridge. There were no credits spared creating the N1, so the life support systems and shielding are the most reliable you could buy, and then further modified to be optimized with this chassis. While the laser cannons were also shielded and had their own stabilizing field that made it nearly impossible for this weapon to malfunction, neither misfiring or rupturing the barrel. We don't really ever see that happen with other ships, but even if it was a very rare event, like a bad primer in a bullet, the Naboo Royal Engineers made sure their weapon systems had the equivalent of the best trigger, bolt, bullets, and barrel all built in. And then there was the Astromech integration. It was not the first to use this system, but definitely one of the most successful, with the R2 unit placed right behind the cockpit, allowing it to operate all the ship's systems, communicate with other R2 units in the fleet, while also carrying out repairs. Naboo loved its astromechs, and used them to repair everything from the larger J-type yachts, where they could magnetize and scoot around on the exterior to repair things even in the middle of combat, while in the N1 it sat right above the data, electrical, and fuel lines, being able to physically manipulate them if need be, though it did most of its work being plugged directly in and optimizing things on the software side. And turning to the cockpit, we see the repulsor lifts that get this thing off the ground were activated with the push of this large button. The pilot has a comfy little headrest pillow, and the ship enters flight mode with the pull of this lever, closing the cockpit's transparasteel bubble, while the control yoke has a central red button that fires the laser cannons. These three screens display everything from the status of the shields, weapons, torpedo count, fuel, navigation, and threat detection, and if we look close we can see it provides a detailed picture of a specific target, with these little droidicas popping up. While the center screen shows the location that the autopilot was guiding you towards, and once you are in space you get a targeting system that shows the path of enemy fighters, with that left screen changing between icons displaying statuses but also text from the R2 unit. Also keep in mind these astromechs have much more computing power when plugged into a ship. As you can see, this entire area behind the unit is a computer designed to be integrated with the R2. And just a couple other things to point out before we move on to the variants in history, is the acceleration compensator right behind the cockpit, and the landing gear was located over here. All those touches, from the chromium to the pointed nacelles, handcrafted parts, and fail-proof weapons, may not seem like that big of a deal from the outside. There are tons of cheaper and simpler ships that can do the same thing, but it's the difference between a Camry and a Koenigsegg. One works really well, and better if you measure in terms of mass production or ease of repair, but the features that one might see as a lot of overkill was exactly what was loved by mechanics and pilots all across the galaxy, who could appreciate this engineering marvel and had use of the specialized applications. And speaking of mechanics, we need to look underneath the hangar to see the repair bay in the Theed Palace. Like the Venator, parts of the flight deck could retract to allow the craft to be maintenance down below, while above we see the racks that could stack the N1s up to 3 high, and on both sides totaling around 50, each with the same recharging/refueling banks in the tail plug. The Naboo ancestral architecture style covered everything in brick, but this was a high-tech material as well, being highly blast resistant, and behind the facade was everything you'd find in a Coruscant spaceport, with the central guiding system using tractor beams to gently float the ships in automatically, working in sync with the beacons and enormous comm towers up in the dome. Couple cool things to note here is the ancient Naboo goddess standing outside for good luck, and a detail that the veteran pilots claim that they don't need any of these guidance systems. They can come racing in safely by simply using the waterfall to gauge the winds. As for its history, the first version was actually the N1L light starfighter, which lacked the main finial, and was both less powerful and more difficult to refuel and charge. The N1 would be developed further into the N1T Advanced, with a wider body to house a more powerful laser cannon, and the finial is raised up and off of the main body, perhaps for additional power or a stronger shield projector. There were also 3 levels of the bomber variant, the NB1, 1S, and 1T, which mostly differed in their payload capacity. The G1 was painted green and cost half the price, scrapping the Class 1 hyperdrive and optimizing for longer travel times. Meant to patrol the Naboo solar system, doing long-range patrols that could stay away from a fuel source for up to 2 weeks. And then there was the NX Police Cruiser, painted blue, and worked with engines and hyperdrives that were about half as powerful as the N1. These units were most often seen by your average citizen, being used by the Naboo Royal Security Forces, while the N1 stayed in the palace and only came out for important ceremonial parades, like a coronation ceremony. But funny enough, this N1 had only been developed a year before the blockade, in the year 33 BBY, with King Ars Varuna ordering their development, something that was at the time considered just a pet project, but it quickly gained the respect of their pilots, and would prove to be his most lasting and valuable contribution to Naboo. It was during this blockade when Anakin and this ship became unlikely heroes. It should be noted that R2 likely piloted Anakin directly into the thick of battle, only to give him controls right over the Lucre Hulk, as R2 had to be in control of everything the entire time. By using the proton torpedoes to destroy the Trade Federation warship, this little N1 entered a mythical status, as details became fuzzier as the tale was repeated, but everyone knew that this unique Naboo ship was a high-end luxury model, with stories exaggerating it as a battleship killer. Which is technically true, but of course even a barrage from its torpedoes could not come close to breaking through the shields of warships of this size. Despite that, the tales made mercenary groups salivate at the prospect of owning one, always being a bit of a status symbol as well, and there were multiple attempts to acquire them, some hoping to bribe members of the government, or pay off some pilot to become a traitor, and mercs from Agamar convinced a Naboo expat named Dren Meln to return home and join the Royal Security Forces, where he also became a lover to his commanding officer, all out of a deep undercover plot to secure a squadron of these fighters. He provided the intel that the Agamarians used to set up an ambush, and he thought he had something in place to disable the ships, but when the plot failed and the N1 squad escaped, the mercs made sure to kill Dren Meln to cover up their involvement. By the Clone Wars era, this ship's features had some unintentional but very useful advantages. Part of why they wanted the ship to directly plug in was to keep royal movements a secret, avoiding intercepting data via wireless transmission, so the only source of downloading was right in the security room or when docked on other Naboo ships, which became especially important during the Trade Federation invasion and the subsequent battle with hordes of droid units during the Clone Wars. And that chromium protection from interference was nice too. They would remain in service on Naboo up through the fall of the Empire, being seen in the celebration following news of the Emperor's death. 9 years after the Battle of Endor, we see that Pelimoto had come into possession of one, housing it in Hangar 3-5 on Mos Eisley. We can speculate endlessly on how this happened, and Padme did have a personal N1, but it was all chrome, no yellow paint. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Force would have it where this was the exact ship used by Anakin, it coming back to his homeworld and being used in the canyons of the Boonta Eve Classic pod race course, all may be nods to this connection. As we can see, it's in heavy need of repairs, but that's actually a good thing at this point, as much like luxury vehicles from our world, there were a lot of things that could be improved on 40 years later.
I mean, these are all handmade. No droids. Because this baby's pre-Empire, she's off the grid. And did I mention she can jump into hyperspace with no docking ring?
That being off the grid part was a part of the Emperor's initiative to track the movement of everyone and everything in the galaxy, those chain codes that we saw introduced in Bad Batch.
It's not just ships, they're registering people too.
She understands this is one of the greatest finds in the entire galaxy, and a gearhead's dream to make a souped up one. We see that they go with more speed, but keep this still remarkable hyperdrive system intact, even if you are forced to use old hyperware, the software for hyperspace.
Okay, I'm looking for mostly bolt-on aftermarket speed mods. This is all hand-built custom. I'm guessing we need vintage hyperware if it's gonna fit this antique.
She seems to hint at it at least doubling the top speed, and the result certainly looks like it. And we really get to see her expertise working with such a specialized craft, as Motto had to understand the latest innovations.
Trust me, the last thing you want strangling your thrust capacitor is a vapor manifold. I fabricated you this induction intake charger that's gonna double your output coefficient.
We see that in lieu of the palace connections, they were able to convert the charging finial tail to work off a gonk droid, while the fuel would be pumped in above the new third engine added right under the cockpit, likely taking up this entire section meant for the Astromech and its augmented computer. Remember, the fuel lines and energizers for the laser cannons were in this region, where we now see this raised device that works to power this triple supercharged engine system. as well as the beefier cannons, which are now raised up and appear to be at least medium if not high power. All of this required additional cooling.
Where did they get a cryogenic density combustion booster?
All that state-of-the-art work on the thinning finial nacelles had to be augmented by these cryogenic attachments. This bare-bones approach made it lighter, but also helped to keep everything cooler. And of course, the R5 Astromech unit thought they were all idiots for thinking they could operate this thing without its help, as both a navigator and repairman.
You know, I figured with your disposition, you'd want to forego the Astromech. Hey! Watch your language around the customers.
And the droid has a point. This normally would be a big problem, but it must be solved by the advances in computing, likely working to include something that just calculated the hyper route, but none of the additional advantages that a full Astromech unit provided. When he takes it for a spin, we still see the same blue glow from the ion engines, and everything in the cockpit seems to work the same, though they did have to add this extra screen to monitor these extra systems, perhaps being solely dedicated to the state of the engines and their heat. As he zips through the canyon and then out of atmosphere, it's obvious that this thing is far faster than your fastest stock ships like the A-Wing or Eta II. It's interesting to imagine how this will be used by Mando as he joins forces with Boba Fett, with Fett manning the heavy firepower but larger and slower Slave One, and Din Djarin zipping around at speeds that nobody would expect. The proton torpedo tube is still in place, but it's unclear if he actually has torpedoes, if there was even room left after all these additions, or how he would find them in a junkyard. Though of course, we shouldn't put this past the Jawas. The ship is a big departure from the Razor Crest, a mobile home and gunship like Slave One, but all Mando has to do is something like Anakin did with the Twilight. It shouldn't be hard to find more spice freighters in this neck of the woods, and that ship did have heavy shields and heavy firepower, while having its own quarters for a crew, and even a hangar for smaller ships like the Jedi Starfighter. A small Mandalorian clan could call this home, and have the power to raid much larger vessels, while hiding the fastest ship in the galaxy, letting it rip out of the back unexpected and acting as an interceptor. There's definitely some amazing potential here. And this isn't the latest existing N1 we see. In 34 ABY, Iden Versio would face off against Janata Security, a private military force that aided the First Order in conquering helpless worlds and kidnapping children to turn them into soldiers. This ship that once embodied the ideals of beauty and peace was now a part of something that struck terror into worlds across the Outer Rim and unknown regions. As JSEC was masterful at modifying and maintaining older vessels, everything from the Nebulon B and GR-75 transports, to V-Wings and even N1 starfighters. They had multiple units of this vessel that was considered rare even when it was being produced new on Naboo. And one of these N1s, owned by the commander of this kidnapping project, Security Officer Lee Mackay, heavily modified his N1 to take advantage of newer parts that were both smaller and more efficient, leaving him room to install seismic charges. It's unclear how many of these it could carry, but despite using the expert tactic of unleashing these in an asteroid field, Iden Versio still managed to lock on and blow this antique out of existence. The last time we see an N1 was during the Battle of Exegol in 35 ABY, where several of them joined the thousands of ships from across the galaxy that sought to finally put an end to the Emperor. At least in the end, the Naboo people could be proud that their iconic ship played a part in restoring peace to the galaxy, and likely acted as a nice morale booster for anyone who saw that flash of chromium as it raced by. So that's it for the breakdown in history, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. In Legends, the chromium was purely for decoration, a nod to a time when their ships did need heavy plating to repel the dangerous electromagnetic rays, as those first primitive starships finally broke out into space. But now shield generators easily protected ships from this. But the royal family wanted to use the chromium plating as a sort of call to their ancient rule, and though this has changed in canon to have a more practical purpose, it's nice that that line about there being so many hand-finished parts actually comes from the old cross-section. I thought it was neat that in this shot you see 3 eras of ships, the X-Wing in red, a New Republic blue variant, and the prequel N1. The full-size prop from Episode 1 was displayed in Boston's Museum of Science in 2005, and would actually hang suspended by wires for several years. There was much hoopla around the question, how can R2 fit into this thing? If the tube is snug around his head, how do his feet fit? Doug Chang, who designed this and many other amazing designs, and who is still working with Star Wars projects including the Book of Boba Fett, said Lucas personally altered the design to cause this problem, all in making it look more sleek, and he loved that it had the chrome look of 50s cars. And so the Episode 1 Incredible Cross-Section book hoped to address this problem by saying that R2 is brought up from the bottom and that his head telescopes up into place. and though not official, they were a cool unlock in the Rogue Squadron games, and would appear in tons of other games as well, all the way up through the new Battlefront 2. Details from this video come from the cross-sections books, Essential Guide to Warfare, and even the novel Darth Plagueis, which has a heavy focus on Naboo. But most important of all, remember, you can build anything with enough credits and faith in your Jawas, and the Force will be with you. Always. What's up, Meta Nerds? This video will be a complete breakdown of the Nikto species, including the many subspecies, and their complete history, including notable Niktos from the time of the Old Republic, through into the Chaos Era after the fall of the Empire, and into the time of the New Republic and First Order. One of these figures is Rin Riven Dai, the Nikto that made a cartel so large Leia Organa feared that he had replaced Jabba in the Hutt clans, being the new Lord of the Underworld.
And had Tarkin been born a Nikto, he would have been exactly like Rin Riven. He's no thug, Leia decided. He's much more dangerous than that. And his goals will be broader than any mere spice cartel. Rin Riven leaned forward, his elbows on the table, hands clasped together as though he were beseeching her.
We honor you, Hutt Slayer. We will always honor you for ridding the galaxy of Jabba the Hutt.
Let's head back to the grid coordinates S9 in the Outer Rim, to the Nikto homeworld of Kintan, neighboring Boz Pity and Klatooine, and right on the edges of Hutt space, within the Kintan system containing a single sun and no other planets, though Kintan itself did have 3 moons. A day would be 32 hours and a year 412 days, with a diameter of 12,054 kilometers, right around Coruscant, and with the most common Type 1 atmosphere breathable by most species. If you ever want to go down the rabbit hole, the reason why so many planets are suitable to so many other species, and why so many are humanoid in shape, has to do with the Celestials, also known as the Architects, who helped shape much of the galaxy, and who really need a video of their own. The terrain has locations like the Endless Wastes, which were thousands of miles of inhospitable rocky regions and lava. As Aayla Secura once said as a Padawan visiting Kintan, river of fire, sand like ground glass. This is not a very pleasant place, Master. Though there were also large seas and forests and swamps, with an overall temperate climate. Some of these lakes appear to be hundreds of times the largest found on Earth, and contained many freshwater predators that made for great fishing. And there were chains of islands in both the seas and lakes that formed archipelagos that would help in the evolutionary divergence of this species, and later we'll see how these were used for great pirate hideouts. These are by far the nicest part of Kintan, though some tourists would make a trip out of heading down into the Canyon of Despair, a canyon made not by water but by lava, the endlessly raging fire river that you could follow up toward the basin of torturous flame which fed the lava and came flowing out from the core of this world. The Canyon of Despair was also fed by the ring of 7 volcanic mountains known as the Burning Moon Range, which was located on the sea but stretched to reach the canyon, and lava flowed out from these and down into the river. This river was then tidally pulled by the interaction of the 3 moons, and every month the path would change slightly, resulting in areas equivalent to dried riverbeds. This intense heating and cooling formed hyper-ferro-feldspar crystals, which are the natural form of the material you find in skyscrapers and nearly every starship. The windows that are made of transparasteel, glass crystal that was stronger than steel. These crystals were often ground up by the seismic activity in this region, and formed the insanely sharp sand that Aayla was complaining about. Since this region made the air extremely hot, at certain times of year as cooler winds collided with it, there would be intense sandstorms that would send these transparasteel shards flying through the air at hundreds of miles an hour, smoothing down rock features into beautiful pieces of natural art, or painfully sandblasting a person out of existence, eroding their skin, muscle, and bones until they became one with the storm. As you would imagine, nothing lived in these regions, but even the creatures that arose in other regions were extremely hardy. And of all the places, Nikto seemed to have originally evolved around these endless wastes. Omnivores that hunted prey and had protection in the form of thick, leathery skin, and these horns that lined their face. Their teeth were like humans, as well as their eyes, though the eyes had a hard protective membrane that could protect them from sandstorms, and even outside of the lava riverbeds, just your normal sandstorm was intense. Which is why these tubes on the side of the neck that were used for breathing also have a protective membrane that they could open or close at will, like flaring your nostrils. And like how our nose hairs help to filter, these were long filtration tubes that could be used when there was too much debris being kicked up, and also work to trap moisture that could then be reabsorbed into the body. They have very few facial muscles compared to humans, and the only real emotions you can detect on their face is when they smooth out these flaps, a sign of happiness like a smile. But with this usually stiff face, scary row of horns, and a membrane over their eye making them dull, most other species thought they were either mean, dumb, or both. Low intelligence being erroneously inferred just by the dim look in their eyes, and even the Jedi Order knew that this species was particularly susceptible to Jedi mind tricks. And as for the rest of their body, it is fairly human, just with claws and these hard knuckles. Now keep in mind that this is not what the original Nikto species look like. That was lost to time, but this is the closest thing we have left. It may sound strange, but in a way the original species is extinct and is now spread into 6 different subspecies after the Midweshu Nova incident. If you watched our Now Hutt video, you saw how a star-going supernova cut off a major hyperroute that ended the rivalry between Coruscant and the Hutt world. No longer competing for legal business, Coruscant would be the hub of everything legit, while the Hutts would dominate all illegal business. While around 26,000 BBY, the star Midweshu was in the system neighboring Kintan, and when it went nova, it didn't just bathe this world in radiation, it was more like a flood that would forever change organic life on this planet. Everything from spine dragons that now rivaled kraits, to mammoth-like tusk beasts that became even more violent, though the Nikto would hunt them down to extinction and cherish ceremonial weapons made from their ivory and bones. The Nikto would be forever altered as well, a fast forward of evolution that rapidly diverged the species depending on what region they were located in, taking what would have developed over millions of years and shrinking it down to a few thousand. Though they never diverged so much as to prevent interbreeding, and it was found that mixed offspring would take on 93% of the traits from a single parent, with some very small notes from the other. The Red Nikto, or Kajensa Nikto, were the most common, and had the greatest number of traits found in all the other subspecies, leading to the conclusion that they were the least mutated. Their skin color and features were already adapted for the Wanshok, or endless waste deserts. The Kadasa Nikto, or Green Nikto, were living in the coastal forest regions. Without the harsh sandstorms, we see that the breathing filter tubes on the side of the head are gone. The horns and flaps around the mouth have flattened out, and a nose emerged from a region that was already protruding. Keep in mind, the Celestials formed many species off of a single genetic template, so similar to how we share genes with other animals, and embryos have structures that diverge into specification for their species. We will see how things like the typical nose and ears found in species from human to Chiss do emerge out of this shared DNA being hit by that radiation flood. And less drastic changes were the narrowing and lengthening of the fingers to help them better climb trees.
Everyone, meet Uplock!
The Esrasal Nikto seem like they're aquatic with these fins, but that prefix in their language actually means mountain, their gray skin helping them blend into their stone surroundings, and they would completely lose the expression of tubes and horns, having a softer skin being away from the sandstorms. And in the misty mountains, this is where those facial fins come in, as these Nikto would see the greatest variance in temperature, from blazing hot sun beating down on them during the day, and cool mountain air at night. And somehow these flaps are also said to improve their hearing. The Glusa Nikto, or Pale Niktos, were an in-between of those last two, having a brown of horns and short fins along the cheeks, and were found in the Glus Elta Islands, and some xenobiologists argue that they emerged from breeding between the mountain and forest ones, but it seems unlikely that these two groups would meet enough to overcome the 93% genetic similarity to one parent. The Mashento Su Nikto, or Southern Nikto, don't really have any dramatic distinctions, looking closer to the red, but do seem to lose most of their horns, the skin is slightly smoother, and the breathing tubes point upward around the neck and back of the head. But in all other ways, they are said to be the most similar to the red, with their skin color actually ranging from white to yellowish orange. And in the final subspecies, perhaps the most divergent, were the Numal Elrul. Thinking back to the shared genes between humans and fish, the mutations on these presumably coastal clans, who now had organs that could extract oxygen from water like gills, while still retaining their lungs to breathe above water, and their leathery skin developed into a sort of scales, which were in a bluish-green color, further hinting that they were closer to the coastal forest Green Niktos. They were so rare that even most other Niktos thought they were just a legend, so the only off-worlders that would have ever seen them would be xenobiologists. Below the waves, they would become prey to other mutated species, like the horned trog whale. Now with all that explained, I do want to take a small step backwards. In the thousands of years before the star went nova, these people had developed to fight fierce beasts, leading them all to have intense warriors at the core of their society. Even the earliest clans came together in order to hunt and build defenses against these monsters, and then against the rival subspecies clans. City-states became countries, and eventually there was a relative peace across the world as civilization built up on the bones of beasts that were now made extinct, no longer a threat to Nikto society. They developed atomic power, but all this time these mutations are still having an effect, causing monsters to emerge from the depths and other unexplored areas of the world. With their high tech, they destroyed their environment to the point of hurting their biosphere globally, leading to the first series of world wars. It would be during the Fourth Planetary War that the Midweshu Nova was identified as the source of all these mutations, the cause of their own subspecies, and this endless stream of monsters that roamed their world. Scientists across the globe all reached this same conclusion, and now saw this blast of radiation as the great shaper of their world, and even responsible for the mutation that changed the Nikto from unthinking lizards to the intelligent creatures they were today. Imagine the turmoil this species was undergoing, still undergoing the effects of mutations during World War IV, all different subspecies using atomic weaponry against each other and against the swarms of things like dragon beasts. But actually, out of all the fear and hatred this would induce, an odd source of unity also sprung up. A sort of intersection of scientism and mysticism. Astronomers are at the core of a new kind of faith that would come to be known as the Cult of Midweshu. This happening about 1,000 years before the formation of the Republic. They deified the star, as it was actually shaping their species, and in their eyes acting like a ball of purifying flame, setting their species on the path to become Uber-Niktos, the ultimate form of their people to strive towards. The cult took in members from each of the subspecies, not discriminating against subspecies in general, but they did implement a form of eugenics, eliminating those who were not taking well to the mutations, and also religious inquisitions to purge all those whose minds were wicked, meaning they didn't agree with the cult. To the cult leaders, they were all to look to the celestial spirit for guidance on how to live their life, a sort of metaphysics applied to the real astronomy and evolution. And since these both revealed themselves during the Fourth War, and inflicted horrible pain on the weak while strengthening those that could handle the mutations, the leaders of these inquisitions would kill off thousands to purify their species and please the star god. Those that knew they would be deemed impure tried to hide out in remote regions, and cult members would work their way up to leadership positions in all the world governments, making the high priest astronomers the de facto leaders of the Nikto. An intense reign of terror would last for 30 years, but keep in mind that like most large-scale histories with sentient beings, this looks insane and horrifying. But they were literally being altered at a rate that would take millions of years. The changes were not just on the outside, but also within their brains and presumably minds, and they were already 4 world wars deep at this point. I think all things considered, it's astonishing that they achieved stability in 30 years, and that they did not kill each other down to a single subspecies or just total extinction. Because in a weird way, that cult leadership did bring global peace, seeing these mutations as a good thing. And as dark as it is, the scientist priests killing off those that were not taking to the mutations may have helped to keep each of the subspecies healthier. This theo-scientocracy would rule for hundreds of years, before they ran into a much larger species, the Hutts. Their empire was expanding to conquer what would become known as Hutt space, and the slugs were gobbling up whole systems every decade. Their success came at the combination of having no moral restrictions, lifespans of 1,000 years, and monopolizing on the markets that provided the vice to the shorter-lived and easy-to-manipulate species. Hutt ships would descend on Kintan in 25,130 BBY, bringing with them Nikto neighbors like the Klatunians and Vodrans, who had already long been conquered and used as the muscle for the cartels. But the Hutt Chiraba was shocked to see how technologically advanced the Nikto were, and weirded out by their one-world cult government. Chiraba retreated to space for time while the agents collected intel from the average citizens and tried to process the Nikto culture. Chiraba noticed that at this point, the commoner more feared the cult and weren't necessarily raving lunatics, or should I say novatics? But the Hutt thought that she might be able to capture the love of the people and destroy the cult all in one move. A single orbital bombardment on the headquarters of the cult government. It would only take a few hours, and combined with messengers that came in peace, not firing a single bolt, but telling the commoner that they had no aims on ruling the Nikto, they just felt the natives should be able to make their own free choice to partake in the greater galactic community. And with that, the Hutt ships retreated back into space. As the world was consumed in revolution that destroyed the cult government centers, it appeared the Nikto implemented some sort of representative government, and voluntarily tied their fates to the Hutts, with Chiraba acting as their friendly guardian in this big, confusing cosmos. But by the next 30 years, we would see the Hutts fighting their only real rival, Zim the Despot. During this war, the Nikto were watching their freedoms being taken away as they were guided into their role of warriors for the Hutts. And of course, when some opposed this, the Hutts used the threat of Zim the Despot, who had earned his title for good reason, in order to strike fear into the common Nikto, and accelerated this stripping of their autonomy until they signed the Treaty of Vontor. Cossack the Hutt had implemented this slow dictatorship tactic across several other species, and this treaty put the Klatunians, Nikto, Vadrans, and Weequay into a permanent serfdom to their slug lords. But of all these races, it would be the Nikto berserkers that would find themselves remembered in legendary tales, remembering the Battle of Vontor, where Zim and his warbots were thoroughly defeated. And though the Niktos were the war heroes, Hutt space was now unquestionably for the Hutts alone. The entire Nikto species would be seen as a pool of warriors, and this relationship did bring material wealth to their homeworld, at the cost of their autonomy. And the next 20,000 plus years would see Niktos guarding all level of Hutt operations, from security at spice mines, to getting into shootouts with pirates, carrying out assassinations, and acting as palace guards. Though it is interesting to note that they did retain their language, also called Nikto, while being fluent in Huttese and Basic. Not too shabby for a species seen as dim-witted. While the flame of the cult would never be fully extinguished, with some cultists attempting an assassination on Churaba, it would become more concentrated off-world in the Sisar run. Though it would get as low as 100 members galaxy-wide, there was a Kajansa Nikto comically nicknamed Jasper McKnives that was around even as late as the Clone Wars, seeing his killings in the gladiatorial ring as blood offerings to Mdweshu. And they were still on the radar of the Republic, as Hutt officials like DeRossi had to promise that the Hutt cartels could keep the cult in check, while the Jedi didn't fully trust them on this, and did retain records on the cult. But their biggest flare-up was circa 4000 BBY. While the galaxy was dealing with the Great Sith War, the most deadly in recent memory, the Nikto began to question why they were dying by the millions to defend the weak, lazy slugs. The cult made sure to get involved and shape the propaganda and develop paramilitary groups, eventually taking the government centers of power on Kintan. Though the Hutts did not give up easy, nor did they fight on the front lines, using their wealth to send wave after wave of mercenary groups that truly tested the hardy warrior spirit of these people like never before. A war that would see a third of their planetary population dead. Though they did force the Hutts off and had some semblance of autonomy, even while countless millions were still acting as essentially slave warriors for their Hutt lords that they couldn't escape from, and they would stay in continuous use by numerous Hutt clans forever.
This is the destiny of the Hutts. The great Hutt Empire will be restored. We must warn the Hutts. We must!
You will do nothing.
About 50 years later, during the Jedi Civil War, we see Nikto swoop gangs on Taurus, and a whole sector of Nar Shaddaa was known as the Nikto Sector, where at least in theory the area would be owned and operated by a Nikto, and the Hutts wouldn't just dictate what goes on there. An impressive feat for a world that was the Hutt's Coruscant, and the moon right above the Hutt Cartel HQ of Nal Hutta. This area was given to the species in honor of Horath Gendi, a Nikto that saved the life of his Hutt master. When he earned his freedom, he formed a powerful gang in this sector, and this would set the trend for gangs fighting for power over this area, with one of the most powerful to pop up during the Cold War era being the Kintan Kings, who even tried to steal a Republic freighter at one point. During the same Cold War era is when alien researchers would encounter more beasts mutilated by the Nova, like the Kintan Crusher and Strider, which would be immortalized in the game Dejarik. But as those gangs on Taurus grew, the older cult and discipline-loving Sith used their like-minded Mandalorian allies to try and reduce crime in the area by hunting down any Niktos with gang affiliation. Around the same time, we see the cult-loving side of these people popping up, with many of them joining the cult of Kai Sazin, named for a fallen female Zabrak Jedi that got her followers to steal technological devices from both the Sith Empire and Republic storehouses, with the goal of creating an ultra-wave transmitter which would give her mastery over the Sith spawns called Rakghouls. There was also the female revolutionary Hutt Breaker, who was able to organize smugglers, gunrunners, Mandalorians, and other slavers to turn on their Hutt overlords during their conquest of Makeb. Seeing that the slugs were distracted by war, she was able to lead this small island of freedom, naming the space station Mek Shah after a friend that she lost to Hutt rule. And around this time is when the secret order of the Morgukai warriors was formed. This was a very unique military force, unlike the Mando, Sith, or Jedi. Based on Kintan but mostly active on Taurus, they were similar to the Mandalorians in the way that they would use their martial prowess to be hired out to protect locals, on this world often fighting against the Sith, though unlike Mandos, they were exclusively Nikto. They had a deep hatred for the Force-wielding Jedi and Sith, but not because they were zealots of the cult of Midweshu. They were separate, but they too were described as a death cult. Imperial forces were suffering so many casualties that they hired swarms of Mandalorian mercs, who were particularly incentivized when they discovered that the Morgokai loved to use cortosis staves, a material that was like Beskar in its resistance to blaster and even lightsabers. So they were seen as prize trophies amongst the Mandos for both their practical purpose, but as proof that you had bested these fierce Nikto warriors. Tython Fom discovered that these Niktos were somehow force-resistant, and though it is never explained how this happened, we can assume that it is either through further mutations or purposeful eugenic breeding and alterations by the cult. As they spread to Nar Shaddaa, they established an impressive temple, which would be raided by Republic forces to free Tython. The state of Nikto society would stay roughly the same for the next 4,000 years, though during the time of the Clone Wars we would see at least 6 Nikto Jedi: Fayek Search, Bat Jul, Asura Set, Joel Bishi, Makish Shalas, and Amagun Dai. They were all aware of the resurgence of the stain on their species, as the cult was kidnapping aliens in the Sissar Run, usually from commercial ships, and ritually slaughtering them to their star god. This intense flare-up killed so many travelers that the Bureau of Ships and Services issued a warning in this sector, to which local businesses and governments responded by placing bounties to kill any free Nikto. You couldn't kill the ones that were owned by some powerful Hutt lord, but it was open season on anyone else, even if the cultists were just a tiny percentage of their species. All were hunted out of fear of these ritual murders. But these killings would be nowhere near the threat of the Morgokai clones. Even the best archives in the galaxy barely had scraps of intel on this cult, with further confusion caused by the fear towards the Midweshu cult. And when 2 members, Tasir and his son Bok, fought against Quinlan Vos and his padawan Aayla Secura, they didn't even know that the cortosis weapons were synonymous with the Morgokai for millennia. They killed Bok's father while taking Bok's hand, and the master of occult knowledge, Count Dooku, contacted him to see if he would be interested in delivering the revenge of the Morgokai. Bok would be the genetic template of a separatist clone army. He was the Jango Fett of the CIS, and their Kamino would be the world's Seleucami. Jedi Master Thome would discover this secret army of force-resistant Niktos, and after the blockade of Seleucami led to an all-out battle, the Jedi would suffer intense losses in the 5 months of fighting that gave a new meaning to the Clone Wars, with all the Bok-spawn Morgokai being killed when explosives flooded the facility with lava. This symbolism for these religious cult warriors must have been heavy, being both a purifying flame that killed them, and also in the form of a flowing river of flame like the landmark on Kintan. During the Imperial Era, Palpatine would place the Morgokai on a long list of illegal religions, and it was believed that their final member was personally killed by Darth Vader. This proud warrior cult coming to an end in a conclave on Kessel, with the one being killed actually considering himself to be an ex-Morgokai, turning away from the crazy cult, whose name was Mikish Shalas. But as you might have expected, there was a small group of them in hiding in some dark nook in the galaxy, as over 100 years later, in 137 ABY, we see one of the cult members in the service of a pirate working alongside Cade Skywalker, this descendant of Vader, taking care of this Morgokai as well. As for the normal Niktos in the galaxy, they would fight to get out from under the fat green thumb of the Hutts, but when Leia put an end to the most prominent slug Jabba, it would mark the most free time in living memory, with many Niktos setting up their own swoop gangs across Tatooine, a proud moment even if they were attacked by their ancient enemy, a Mandalorian bounty hunter. But by far the most notable Nikto of this era would be Rin Riven Dai. No weird cults or blind warrior rage. He operated with a cool head and shrewd mind for business. He was 8 years old at the outbreak of the Clone Wars, and by the time of the Empire, he was a small-time spice dealer, feeling the oppressive bulk of his Hutt overlord. Major spoilers for that book I mentioned at the beginning, Bloodline. It really is a great new canon addition, so go ahead and skip this video if you don't want to hear it, but I just want to end on this. Yet he would grow his small group of thugs to a proper cartel, and then explode to run operations that were so large it was said to rival the Hutts at their peak, creating problems for businesses all across the Outer Rim, and especially on Ryloth, where he mastered the slave and spice trade. He shocked people even as cultured as Leia Organa, who observed that he had a noble air of refinement. Not just shocking for a Nikto, but a great change from the gluttonous, stinking slobs like the Hutts. Rinriven Dai came to her attention in 28 ABY, 6 years before the First Order would reveal itself. During Leia's investigation into this Nikto cartel, she traced its funding back to the Amaxine Warriors, a mysterious paramilitary group, which itself popped out of nowhere with an abundance of credits. The process of following the money eventually showed her the very first bits of evidence at a massive military force hiding in the shadows of the unknown regions, that was for some reason pumping credits into organizations that would spread crime and chaos all throughout the New Republic territory. Rinriven Dai had learned a lot from his Hutt lords, and he hated that he had to make an enemy with the Hutt Slayer Leia, as he tells her that all Nikto love her, not for her work in the rebellion or as a senator, but they know she's the one that killed Jabba the Hutt.
Hutt Slayer.
Rinriven breathed, in genuine reverence.
This is what we call you among ourselves, and it is a far greater title than either senator or princess could ever be.
And she will forever be a Nikto legendary hero, even if Rinriven had to kill her. Of course, he failed, and it cost him his life, sending the underworld into even more chaos, with the Niktos, Hutts, and crime lords from other species all waging wars to become the new lord of the underworld. Chaos that would inadvertently help the First Order, as their propaganda gained followers in the New Republic territory, who agreed that in order to fix things, you had to have First Order. So that's it for their history and breakdown, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind the scenes stuff. The logo of the Speeder Gang in the Book of Boba Fett is also seen on Caltho the Hutt. I haven't seen anybody point that out yet, I just noticed this in making this video, so if you have seen other people talk about this or have more info, please comment down below. I plan on making a short video about this next. And I didn't want to include this part from Legends as they were mutually exclusive, but in the year 26 ABY, the Yuuzhan Vong captured Kintan, and 75% of their population was either killed or enslaved. Kintan means grilled meat in Japanese, and a lot of barbecue restaurants come up when you search their homeworld. A lot of this info comes from novels, a ton of comics, the new canon show Resistance, and a lot of reference and guidebooks including The Essential Guide to Warfare, Chronology, Alien Anthology, Lords of Nal Hutta, and Outer Rim World. But most important of all, remember, a cult that combines science and religion is always more terrifying than the sum of its parts. And the Force will be with you, always.